And just give it a minute as always so people can hop in and tell me if the chat is working.
Sure. Do you want to kick it off then, or should I?
I'll start off with my normal like little introduction thingy. Gotta make sure it's actually showing up on the YouTubes. How has your week been?
Pretty good. I actually had vacation, so which is why I have time to do this.
Cool. Sounds good. Question mark. All right, so Michael, Mikhail, how do you pronounce your name?
Uh, I'm German, so it's actually Michael, but call me Michael. It's
Mikhail,
fine.
is that about right?
Yeah,
So thanks for coming on. I appreciate you taking the time to have a conversation with me. Would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself before we get started?
sure. So I'm an engineer from Germany, and my passion ever since I got into robotics into university was basically the philosophy and science of the mind and free will. Which is the topic of today's debate. And I run a YouTube channel called Engineering Philosophy. If you want to check it out, talk a lot about stuff like free will, science of free will, and other stuff there.
Cool. So we wanted to talk about free will. You think free will is a thing?
Yeah. I mean, but basically, the reason why I hit you up to have this conversation is because I heard you say in a discussion that as an atheist you say we don't have free will, and I was like, yeah, I'm an atheist, but I think we have free will. And also, if I remember correctly, you then said basically, yeah, if there's quantum randomness, that's just randomness that can't be free will, which for me always is like the thing where it's like, hey, I'm not sure if he's looked deeply into this because for me, it's like the obvious answer to free will is quantum randomness. And I'm like, where should it come from if not from quantum randomness?
Well,
So,
how is a random action free? So what do you mean by free will?
yeah, that's always the biggest point. I think um, a lot of the common scientific objection that some neuroscientists have to free will is that they basically the debate is largely a false dichotomy, in my opinion. There's basically the determinists that say there's no free will, everything is predetermined in the universe. And then there's the people that have this religious perspective of free will. Basically, you have a soul that is independent of your body, and this soul is completely free to make decisions. I mean, obviously, that's not the case. So when I talk about free will, I really mean something more limited. Basically, of course, your biology influences your decisions, and you don't have a soul, in my opinion, that's independent of your body and your brain. But still, what goes on in your brain changes the course of the universe and is not predictable or not fully predictable by measuring all the variables going in. So I would say free will is more like a degree of free will. Say you have a 10% chance to become an ultramarathoner, and 90% you won't because you're too lazy and it's actually really hard. But if you decide to and really take all the necessary steps, you can become that and you can change the outcomes. Um, so basically, as I said, the main objection in my opinion comes from these two misunderstandings that even many neuroscientists have. That's basically that uh, to have free will, you need a soul that's independent of the brain. I heard many neuroscientists say, yeah, we found that all our decision making is just going on in the brain, so obviously we can't have free will. And the second part is that many think that the universe is a clockwork universe. Still, even many physicists hold this perspective, even though quantum physics for 100 years has disproven experimentally all the hypotheses that are pointing to a deterministic universe. And it basically, to this day, it looks like what happens in the quantum world is actually completely random. And as soon as you have randomness, you have a chance to change the outcomes. Because what true quantum randomness really means is basically that what will happen in the next second in the quantum world is not determined yet. Basically, it depends on what each particle does or does not do. And as long as you have a brain that is capable of judging probable outcomes in the world, and then tweaking the variables to change these outcomes, or at least to change the probabilities of these outcomes, you have a chance to alter the course of the universe. I mean, the main point there is, I would say, are you familiar with the Libet experiment? The Libet, yeah. So the most people hear about the simple Libet experiments when they reject free will, where basically the simple Libet experiment is that you wire up a brain with EEGs, and then you say, press randomly press a button, please. And basically what they find is that in your brain, a potential builds up before you press the button. So the scientists actually can predict when you're going to push the button a short amount of time before you actually put the button. And this was the first when Libet did this simple experiment. He said, "Oh, okay, obviously you don't have free will, because what your subconsciousness does already determined that you will click before you are conscious that you click." But later he actually did different versions of this experiment, and one of the most interesting to me is he did the same experiment, but he told people, okay, before you click, I'll ask you to abort sometimes. So basically, when he measures this potential building that you want to click, he sometimes would play a sound, and if you hear the sound, you then either stop or don't stop. And what he found is that basically up to very, very shortly before you really click, even if though your brain is already building a potential, your subconscious is already triggering, oh, I want to click now. If you consciously, or if you hear at least a sound, you still can say, oh, no, I don't want to click now. So you can basically reverse the decision that's already been building up in your brain. And what that suggests to me is that basically, sure, your subconsciousness is a part of you, and if you basically, if you can view it like a computer, if you basically say to your brain, okay, brain, I want to that you randomly click a button, then the mechanistic part of your brain says sure, and produces random intervals, and builds up potential and says, okay, now is a good time to click. But you still are in charge to say, no, I don't want to click, up until right before, when already all the neurons are firing and your finger is starting to move. This is what to me is one of the strongest evidences that you are in control. And also the Libet experiment, the first one, the simple one, was criticized a lot by many other scientists because basically it's the interpretation is something that to me shows that so many scientists are also expecting like a soul and independent thing, because what would you have expected to find if you say the brain is completely mechanistic and we have free will? Would you then expect not that there is a biological process still in the brain that triggers your emotion, that basically it's clear that there needs to be a chemical potential built up in the brain that triggers your action to click, because otherwise, if it all was just instantaneous, then it would basically be magical.
So, what is your definition of free will? What is free will?
So my definition is that basically, let me read this. Any conscious actor who can evaluate future outcomes and actively intervene in altering the probabilities of these outcomes by manipulating the influencing variables has a degree of free will. And the degree of free will is determined by the degree to which one can estimate probabilities of future events and the degree to which one can actively intervene in altering these probabilities.
So that
So
doesn't work as a definition, because you've imposed actively and intervene, which are already the question here is, what does the free part mean? And you're just adding synonyms of free into the definition of free will. So what is free will? Is it the ability to do otherwise? Does that mean that your consciousness has an impact on the things you're doing?
yeah, what I mean is basically, this is why I added the degree of free will. Basically, what I meant is with active intervene is how actively can you intervene. So this is just basically a two-part question. The first question that is really, how does consciousness even work, which unfortunately is not fully solved. And the second part is how do you want to define free will? Because for me, A very
Yeah,
complicated
I
AI
don't care
could,
about the brain right now. Like neurology
yeah,
doesn't matter. I just want a philosophically coherent definition of free will that isn't
yeah,
logically impossible.
yeah. So basically, I'm not sure if I understand your objection correctly.
So theists normally define free will as the ability to do otherwise, but any decision you
Yeah,
make is going to be determined by one of two things. Either determinism, like some previous force or reason that causes you to make the choice, or some random quantum function. One of those two things is going to cause your choice. There's no consciousness in there. It's either determined by prior things or it's randomness by prior things. And if it's determined, that means it's a domino and a chain, and so there's no free will there. And if it's random, then it also has nothing to do with your consciousness, and so it's also not free will. So neither
yeah.
quantum determinism nor randomness give you any freedom of any kind.
There's actually two more options.
Okay, go for it.
One option is basically if there's random processes that are ongoing, and basically random is a bad word. It's actually probabilistic. So these have probabilities. And if you, whatever you are, what is going on in your brain, has a chance to alter the probabilities of these outcomes, you can change the course of the universe. And the second is what Roger Penrose proposes in his theory of consciousness, that probably the random quantum processes are directly what consciousness is. So basically, the theory of Roger Penrose would be a very strong free will, where you say basically um, these random collapses are actually not random, but they are conscious events. They're conscious decisions of particles. Um, basically, if you think about it, if you have a particle that is being shot at a double slit experiment, if you don't measure it, the particle goes through both slits, and if you measure which slit it goes through, you force the particle to decide, and it goes to the left or the right slit.
So I'm not following at all
And
here. So random event happens, like your particle collapses.
yeah,
That's a random event as far as we can tell. If you want to just call that consciousness, that doesn't in any way help at all address the problem. Either the decision by the conscious particle that we can name Bob, the Bob particle, made a decision. Either it made a decision because of reasons, and those reasons
yeah,
determined the decision, or there was some fundamental random thing that occurred. Those are the two options. Neither of those are free in any sense. So how does any of this give you free will?
the second option gives it to you by a feedback loop. So if you basically, you know that the particle is going 50-50 through the left or the right slit, but you have a magnet that basically makes if you switch it on, makes the particle go through the right slit with 90% and 10% to the left slit. You still have not fully determined the path of the particle, but you have influenced the outcomes. And if you do a lot of these, if you influence a lot of these variables, you can make a significant difference by what you decide.
What does any of that have to do with free will? So
Yeah,
I can have magnets determine it with 100% certainty, or 1% certainty. That's still either determined or random. There's still no free will there. Like you still haven't given a
yeah,
coherent
it's
definition of
still
free
a
will.
it's still a probabilistic process, but your decision to do something, what happens in your brain,
You're
has
no
changed the
no.
outcomes.
That's a
It's
category
probably,
error. So you're talking about the decision itself. We don't care about what your decision does. That's irrelevant.
yeah,
How do you make the decision in the first place? Either the decision is made by prior non-conscious things that are determined, or prior non-conscious things that are random. So your decision doing something is irrelevant. I don't care what your decision does. What I care about is what caused your decision. How did your decision come about? And you can't say your decision did it,
yeah,
because that would be circular.
but no, that's exactly what a feedback loop is. So basically, what you're saying is that it's always turtles all the way down. There's always a cause for before that was deterministic.
Yet your
This is
consciousness
for
didn't
one.
exist before your consciousness.
Yeah, but your consciousness exists, and basically your consciousness is influenced by variables going in. But your consciousness then can also influence the variables that go on in the universe. So it's basically what your brain does. What your brain is really good at is your brain looks at what is happening in the world around me, and then tries to estimate the path through the world that gives you the highest probability of survival and happiness. This is essentially what your brain is for. And what it does for that is tweak all the variables that are going on in the universe that to make your life the best outcome possible. And basically this is not circular because um, it would be circular if the universe was completely deterministic. Basically, if everything's predetermined just by physics without quantum randomness, then obviously no matter what happens in your brain would change no outcome. But as soon as there's randomness that is not predetermined, that it's just basically random coin flips that are happening at a certain point in time, and you can influence the probabilities of these coin flips, then you actually can change what will happen in the future.
Begging the question. So if there's randomness in my brain and the randomness causes me to have a conscious experience, the conscious experience does nothing. The randomness is the cause, not the conscious experience. If there's some determined factor, like I ate moldy cheese and the moldy cheese caused my brain to have a lack of oxygen or whatever, and that caused me to have a conscious experience, that's the cause of the consciousness. My consciousness didn't do anything. So how does the consciousness cause itself when it's either going to be caused by a non-conscious determined thing or a non-conscious random thing?
I mean, I think we need to separate here the two theories, because I said basically what I personally think is a very good theory, and I'm not alone, is the theory of consciousness by Penrose, but it's not actually necessary to give you
But it wouldn't matter. His model wouldn't make a difference in this example, because even if conscious particles are conscious, that doesn't make a difference to your consciousness. Your consciousness has no impact on your decisions whatsoever. It's your consciousness is determined by other things that are not your consciousness, either determined other things or random other things.
Yeah, but that is exactly the question. Is it fully determined, or is it not fully
I don't
determined?
care if it's either partially determined, fully determined, partially random. Either way, your consciousness doesn't do anything. Your consciousness is a result of other things that are not your consciousness. And what your consciousness is going to do is 100% determined by those other non-conscious things, whether it's random other things or determined other things.
No. So basically, yeah, your consciousness is caused by the brain and by mechanistic processes. Although the evidence strongly suggests that your brain is not purely computational. But even if it was, let's say, even if you have a very complex computer, and that computer uses a Bayesian neural network, basically what your brain does, something that evaluates probabilities. What goes in only inside that silicon chip can actually change how the universe goes on, as long as there's quantum randomness. And the computer has ways to manipulate the outcomes of this quantum randomness.
That makes absolutely no sense here. So imagine we have a switch. There's a switch on the table, and a quantum random fluctuation can cause the flip to switch. Does the switch have free will?
The switch does not have free will.
Why?
Because the switch is just changed by the quantum randomness.
Right. So if consciousness is like the switch and your consciousness is changed by the quantum randomness, how is that any different from the switch?
Let's say instead of a switch, you have you have this, what you said, you have a random event that triggers a switch, and you have a computer that is very complex, and the computer basically can evaluate the probabilities of a quantum event happening. So basically, it's just stochastics. The more time passes, if it's maybe a radon decay, the more likely it becomes that the switch flips. And let's say the computer does not want the switch to flip, but it has just a certain amount of interventions that it can make. Basically, it can grab the switch and hold it, that it does not flip, even if the quantum thing triggers it. And the algorithm that is there, if it's sufficiently complex enough, can basically prevent the switch from flipping with a certain probability. And basically what living beings or sufficiently complex AIs do is basically they currently try, what can I do to alter the outcomes? In this case, how can I use my, let's say, 10 tries to keep the switch from flipping, to actually keep it from flipping? And the thing for me about free will is it predetermined? Basically, can you know by just knowing the detailed layout of the computer chip and exactly the source code you put in when it will trigger in advance?
Well, it depends on what you programmed it to do. If you programmed it to read a quantum fluctuation, and you can say, if there's a quantum fluctuation that flips the switch, and the computer is programmed to not flip the switch if there's a different quantum fluctuation that doesn't occur, then one quantum fluctuation will not flip the switch and another quantum fluctuation will not flip the switch, but both together will flip the switch. So you can have a computer who will prevent the switch from being flipped, even though the quantum fluctuation happens, by measuring another quantum fluctuation. Does that have free will?
If it can, if it can play with the outcomes, if not only the quantum fluctuations determine if the switch flitches, but if the computer algorithm actually can intervene to change the outcome based on what he evaluates the probabilities to be, then it has a degree of free will.
So the computer is determined to, if it measures the number 6, it will stop the switch from flipping, and if it measures the number 7, it will not stop the switch from switching. And so it's measuring the ground, looking for these numbers, and it measures a 6, and so it says it's not going to let the flip switch. Does it have free will?
Yeah, more or less, yes. Basically, what you have to understand about the quantum randomness is that the quantum randomness is not like, it's going to be a 6 or a 7. It's always an either or until you measure.
No. So I'm saying there's just a piece of paper with a bunch of numbers on it, and the computer is randomly just looking at the numbers one at a time in an order. And if it turns up a 6, then it's going to not let the switch flip. And so then a quantum fluctuation happens, and the flip does not switch because the computer sees a 6, and so it shuts off the switch. Does the computer have a free will?
Oh, okay. No, in that case, not, because basically the computer is just following an order of numbers. It's not actually
right. So we have in our brain
actually influencing the probabilities or intervening in the probabilities.
Right. So in our brain, we have a bunch of neurons that are just following its orders. They're determined neurons, and we have these random quantum features that are like the random quantum fluctuation that can flip the switch. And if you add those together, you don't get free will. What you get is a computer who's looking at numbers and is determined to act based off of those numbers in a specific way, combined with a random feature of the quantum fluctuation flipping a switch. And as you said, that doesn't give us free will. So how does adding a whole bunch of those together get you free will?
I think, for one, we have not yet really, I think I have not really conveyed when I would even give a deterministic computer a degree of free will. I'm not sure if I conveyed that. And the second part is, the brain is a neuronal computer. That's part of what the brain does, but we also know that that's not all the brain does, because a lot of the functions that
I don't care about the brain here. So all I want to know is what combination of determined things, where if it reads a 6, it stops the switch, and random things where there's a quantum fluctuation and the switch is flipped. How does that combination of things get us free will? I don't care about how our brain does it or what our brain does. Is there some other thing we need? Can you do it with just a combination of those things?
As soon as there's a feedback loop, that happens. So as soon as the algorithm learns about the probabilities, and then...
Well, it doesn't need to know anything about the probabilities to have a feedback loop. You can have a feedback loop in a computer, and the computer knows nothing. Calculators have feedback loops all the time.
What I mean is Bayesian feedback loops, Bayesian neural networks. If you have...
Why would it matter if it's Bayesian or not? The kind of feedback loop makes no difference. A Bayesian model is just a way to analyze the data. It doesn't actually do anything specific. It's just a way of analyzing data.
Yeah, but the thing is with the probabilities of randomness. If you have a feedback loop that is based on the probabilities, basically that has a goal that I want to maximize the probability of this outcome, and it reads the probabilities that are going in and has some manipulator that can change the probabilities.
Well, so that's again begging the question. Either if it's going to change the probabilities, that's the thing we're talking about. Does it change the probabilities based off of determined things like reading the 6, or other random things like the quantum fluctuation flipping the switch? So if it's going to change the probabilities, that's the decision we're talking about. We have a computer that wants to change the probabilities in some ways. There are two ways it can change the probabilities. One, it's determined, it sees a 6 and stops it from occurring. Two, it looks at a different quantum fluctuation and says, does this quantum fluctuation occur? And then it's going to happen based off of randomness. Those are the only two ways that it can influence the probabilities. So if you want the computer to influence the probabilities, the only ways to do it are either it's determined by some programming, or it's based off of a different random measurement. And those are the only two ways. And neither of those involve consciousness. Those are exiting the closed loop. That's no longer self-referential.
Yeah, but what happens is when you have an regulating algorithm using Bayesian or any probabilistic neural network reviewing true stochastic events, and it can influence the probabilities. At some point, you decouple, it becomes decoupled. Basically, the incoming variables uh, are not correlated to 100% with the outcomes anymore. And that's what I mean.
Well,
Basically, you
any
can
random
know
system does
everything.
that, so you don't need a
You can
system for
know
that.
any line of
Every
you
random
can
system works that way. So here
yeah
again, my question is so we have a computer, and it's looking at a switch or something, and it wants to influence the probability. So right now, the switch just flips if there's a random quantum event. The switch flips, and the computer wants to influence the probabilities the switch is going to flip. So what it does is it has two options. One, it's going to be determined by some programming to look for a 6, and if it doesn't see a 6, then it can allow the switch to flip with some greater probability by reading a different quantum fluctuation. So it looks at a different switch, and this different switch has a probability of 1 in 10 of flipping. And if it doesn't flip, then it will allow the first switch to flip. Therefore, the computer is saying that this first flip has a probability of 50-50, and if I look base allowing it to flip off this second flip, which has a probability of 1 in 10, now this probability has a 45% chance of flipping. So I have affected the probabilities of this second flip
yeah
by looking at the first flip, by looking at a second flip. Where is that all free will is? Is that you're just defining free will as two random events?
I mean, what you describe would be the weakest form of free will. Basically, as I said, there's degrees of free will. How much can you influence? And in that case, basically, it's just passively looking at what happens with one switch. And yeah, in that case, it's already changing what's happening. But um, the question is basically, it basically the computer you describe has only the option to look at a switch and act based on what that switch does. It
No.
does not actually develop a strategy on when to flip which switch, right?
Wait. So the develop the strategy part is what I'm talking about. There's only two possible
Yeah,
strategies. One is it's determined, or two is it's looking at a different random switch. Every single possible methodology you can propose is going to be one of those two things. It's determined, a complicated determined system, or a complicated it's looking at a random switch system. Those are the only two possibilities. There isn't a third possibility to achieve what you're asking. That's it. Like whatever method no matter how complicated you make it, will all be simplified down to one of two things. Either it's determined or it's random.
yeah, and I mean the evidence points to at least the quantum physics level being random. And
Well,
this
I'm
and
granting
as
that it's
it's
a
what I tried to
possibility, but
complain
what
is
is
if it's random, you then can change the outcomes, and that's basically what it is. But in the case you're describing, so basically
well,
the
you can't change
computer,
anything here. So again, the in order for the computer to change the probabilities, it has to look at another non-computer thing and say, does this thing change? So it's looking at two different
yeah,
things outside of itself. It's looking at the first switch, and it
that has different probability influencing the other switch, that would already be something that makes over long term. Basically, if you measure millions of flip switches, the computer would already make a difference that is not predictable. But the more complicated that system gets, the less predictable it gets. And as soon as you get to a more complicated feedback loop where the computer is actually learning about strategies, very quickly, what's happening in the computer decouples from the ingoing variables, and what the computer will be doing is not predictable anymore by
why does
the
its
ingoing
predictability?
variables.
Its predictability makes no difference here. I don't care about whether or not we
Yeah,
can predict it.
predictability is actually what gives you the free will, in my opinion, because basically what you're saying is basically that you define free will as just to be impossible. You say, if it's something is random, it cannot be free will because that was random, and if it's deterministic, you don't have free will. But what I'm saying is what is free will? What is the free will that we experience? And this is our free will. I mean, everybody knows I cannot just flap my arms and fly away. But what I experience is that basically, if I set my alarm for 6 tomorrow and maybe put my running shoes next to my bed, then I have a higher chance that I'll go running tomorrow. And this is basically what free will is, that we find strategies how we can influence the outcomes.
So my argument is a little more detailed. It's saying everything is either determined or random. And no combination of any of those things will ever give you free will because it's either just going to be determined or random. So different kinds of randomness or different kinds of determination, none of that's free because it all boils down to the same thing. It's still just determined or random. So my
But
argument is that no
randomness,
combination of either of those things gets you free will.
randomness in my opinion is what gives you free will, because as long as, I mean, random, as I said, random always sounds like the probabilities are always the same, it's probabilistic. So
Well, no. So I don't care
the
about the
outcomes
probability
are
change. The probability change
in
is
quantum
irrelevant.
physics are weighted, and you can change the weighting of this
I,
outcome.
I don't care. I don't care if you can change the weighting. That's not a part of
Yeah.
my objection. My objection isn't that it can be changed. The weightings can be changed. I don't care. That's still a part of randomness because I said no possible combination of these two things, which includes all of the possible different ways you could change the weightings, is still not going to be free will. Because my what I heard you say was that our consciousness can affect the probabilities, and it
Yes.
can't. That you cannot do that. You would just essentially, in the examples I just listed, you admitted it cannot do that. Either your brain is
Yeah, no,
determined
in
to read a random thing, and the random thing affects it, and your brain doesn't do anything, or your brain is random and it is affected by other random things, and so your brain doesn't do anything. So, no, in none of the examples you gave does the consciousness itself have any impact on the decision.
yeah, I think you're wrong there, because in the explanation you said with the switch, the consciousness, if the consciousness is just a computer that reads the switch and either then flips the other switch or does not, that would already make a difference. And but
Well,
this
the
is just
computer isn't
very
making a
simple.
difference. The computer is just reading the two switches. The two switches make a difference. The computer does nothing but just hold its arms out. So the computer isn't the one making the difference in the probabilities. It's the other switches that are doing the work. It's not the computer.
So you say it's just, this is what I tried to clarify. But you say the computer is just reading the switches and it's not actually intervening in the course of whether the switches flip or not, or not influencing the probabilities of the switches.
It's influencing the probabilities of one switch by reading the other switch.
Yeah.
So it's the computer isn't doing anything here. It's just saying that if this switch flips, then this one I will flip or not flip. If this other switch flips, that's it. That's all it's doing. The computer makes no difference to the probabilities. The
Yeah, this is
probabilities are
what I
affected
said.
by the two separate quantum events.
This is what I said before. What is necessary is the computer actually having a goal, because what I said, which is
That's begging
you
the
need a
question.
strategy that
You can't
basically
say that. You can't say that. You have to
no.
say, how does the computer do that? How does the
This
computer
is
understand and make a change?
how is this begging the question?
So
It's
so
not at all, because if
because
the computer has
the
just no
thing you're
strategy,
trying
just
to
observes, it's
define
not
is
intervening.
because you're using the thing you're trying to define in your definition. So I want to know, how does the computer affect the probabilities? There's two ways it can do this. One, it's determined, not free. Two,
Yeah.
it looks at a different random thing which is not itself, and then that random thing will change the probabilities, but the computer does nothing because the computer is determined.
Yeah, but this is what I what I try to convey. This is where the feedback loops come in. If it looks at probabilities and has a strategy, it wants to achieve something,
What do you mean looks
and
at
then
probabilities?
has
It can't look at probabilities. It looks at
basically,
switches. This switch
yeah,
has X probability, and the probability is about the quantum thing. It doesn't look at any probabilities. It looks at the switch, and the switch has a probability.
yeah, but the computer knows the probability, right?
No, the
If you,
computer doesn't know anything.
for
The computer's
most,
looking at a switch. The switch has a
yeah, but
probability
that's
based off of the physics. The quantum randomness itself has the probability. The computer doesn't know anything.
yeah. Well, this is why I said you need Bayesian network, because Bayesian networks do exactly this: evaluate the probabilities of the outcomes,
It makes
and
no
then try to
difference.
change these
The
probabilities.
language you use to measure the probabilities makes zero difference here whatsoever. It does not in
No,
any
it
way
does.
help your case. Like if you
It
use
does.
French or English, the same thing. Doesn't matter what language you use. Bayesian epistemology does not add anything to the system. It's just a language to describe the system.
Yeah, but this is what I mean. It does. Because basically, if the computer just reads the two switches and does nothing, yeah, it does nothing. But if the computer actually has a goal, like say, I don't want this switch to flip, and it cannot just hold the switch all the time, but it wants to figure out a strategy to prevent this from flipping, and it knows this has a 50% chance to flip in within 10 seconds. Then the computer can develop a strategy to actually prevent that switch from flipping. And this feedback is basically looking at what does the world, does this random event occur or not? And the longer it does not occur, it goes, oh, okay, now I should do something because now it's likely that it will happen. And if I do something now, I have a high chance of preventing that switch from flipping. And that is what I say is free will.
So this is basic AI programming. You can find the 2-minute papers on this. If you have a computer that's programmed with a algorithm to say it wants the switch to not flip with the longest period of time, and right now there's just quantum randomness, so it flips with a 50% chance every second. And it has 10 other switches to pick from, and it starts on switch 1, and switch 1 switches at an 80% chance, and so if you combine the two, you'll get a 20% reduction, which is 10, so it'll be a 40%. It'll flip 40% of the time every second. But then the second switch has a 50-50. So if you combine the first switch with the second switch, you now have a 25% chance that the first flip is going to switch. And the AI is just going to switch between them, count the time intervals, and pick whichever switch that it causes the first switch to only happen every the longest period of time or whatever. Where is the free will in this? Like, we can do this with a computer right now, and you're saying that just because it's testing things and measuring the outcomes and saying, well, this measurement has the greatest value, I'm just going to pick it. This is somehow free will. Like, it doesn't make any sense.
To me, not, because basically, if this computer really uses the probabilities to influence the outcome of the universe, and if it gets to a point where basically you cannot predict when the computer will flip the switch anymore by anything outside what's going on in the computer, or by the variables going into the computer, because these random systems very, very quickly devolve from being predictable. Then what else would you call it than free will? What this thing does?
Randomness. There's nothing free about it. It's just randomness. So the computer, whether or not we can predict it, is irrelevant. Our ability to predict things is irrelevant. The question here is that, does the computer, does its own conscious system have an impact on the probability? And the answer is no. All it does is the computer is determined. If
Yeah, but it does have an impact, right? If it
no,
uses the probability of one switch to influence the probability of the others and has a strategy, basically, free will is always about the goal, what you want to achieve. Basically, it wants to not have the switch flip or something. That's essentially the freedom it has. And
well, it doesn't have any
in
freedom.
that
It's completely
case, the
determined.
computer is very limited free because it does not actually learn and improve its strategies and change its strategies maybe. But it
Learning, the
already has
learning has no
it
impact
changes
here.
the outcome of the universe, right?
No, it doesn't change anything any more than a stick on a ledge changes anything. Like, the computer is determined. If, like, these 10 switches are all on, then I will allow this 11th switch to be flipped. And all 11 switches are quantumly random. The probability has been impacted on this first, the main switch can only switch if all other 10 ones have been switched, and they're all quantumly random. Now, the computer is physically stopping this first switch, so it's affecting the probabilities to a very significant degree. It's stopping it with a very high level of probability that it will never flip, because the probability is so low that all 10 of the other switches will flip at the same time. And you're just calling this free will when it's just the determined computer is determined to say, wait for a value of 10 for these switches, and then if it does, then it just releases the lock on this other one. Like, why do you think that qualifies as free at all?
As I said, it qualifies as free as soon as the computer is actually starting to develop this agency that is basically looking at the probabilities, using its strategy, and maybe even developing a strategy. And the more it can, the more influence it has on the probabilities, and the more it can change its own strategy over time, the more freedom it has. That's basically how I define the degrees of freedom.
Yeah, but all of its ability to change the programming is just other programming. It's determined by other programming. So it's using other programs
Yes.
that it's already determined by to change its other programs, which is already determined by.
Yes, but the freedom comes from basically, if you have two computers in two separate rooms that use such an algorithm, over time, they will develop completely different strategies and behaviors.
Okay, they're still determined. So I don't see how that would free will. So yeah, like if I
Yeah,
put
but the behavior of the computer is determined. But the
yeah
behavior of the system the computer is influencing is not determined, and the way the computer learns is not determined.
the way the
And the
computer learns
computer,
is 100% determined. So the information that is sent to the computer is random. The way the computer processes the information is 100% determined. And so, but
yeah,
the
but the way the
way
computer learns is usually not determined because the computer usually, if it's a self-learning AI, usually they learn over time and they usually use
neural
algorithms
networks,
that
which are
change and
100%
evolve over
determined.
time.
So neural
But the
networks,
learning is
every
not. The
AI is
learning,
100% determined. They're all completely determined. The thing that isn't determined is the information they're receiving. So they receive
yeah,
information from the outside world, which they have no control over. So that's not determined.
yeah. But
But the
in the
way they
learning
process
process,
it is
this outside
100% determined.
information changes the actual AI, and the AI changes the outside world. And this feedback cycle is exactly what I would say is free will. I mean, there's maybe since this is so contentious, I think it's maybe that you say that you just don't want to call this free will. The second
Well,
side of
I
free
want
will
you
that
to
is
explain
not.
how it's free will, because you're just saying, oh, look, there is a determined system that is hit by a random system, and then the
Yeah,
determined system moves. Ah, wow. And then it affects other random systems because it's been moved. Amazing.
yeah, yeah. It's free will because what free will, I mean, free will, all you can say about free will from if you say I have free will, what do you mean? This means that you, if you're not religious, you say that you basically what's going on in your brain can actually alter the course of the universe in a way that's not predicted by what is. See, if you measure every
No one means that by
single
free will.
atom and
No,
quantum in the universe
no
right
one,
now,
no one means that by free
you,
will. That's not what they mean by free will. By free will, they mean that my consciousness itself is
yeah.
able to make a difference in my own actions. So my consciousness can affect my actions. It's not determined by my brain. It's not determined by randomness in the quantum field. Is that my ideas, my thoughts, my motivations are themselves the cause of my actions. And that's blatantly false.
Yeah, I mean, I would not say. I think most people mean I, and not just my conscious I, because what I am is just more than just my consciousness. My subconsciousness is also part of me, right?
Sure, yeah, but I'm talking about things that are not you. So the chemical composition of your brain that you have no control over is not you. The physical determining factors of the shape of your neurology is not
Yeah,
you.
but
The random quantum fluctuations are not you. So those things determine your consciousness, not the other way around.
so basically, this is what I said before of the second part. That's just not proven yet, but it's looking like basically what Roger Penrose's theory would say, that the quantum fluctuations actually are what is you. But even if you go to the purely mechanistic side, um, if you just say all my brain chemistry, brain processes, information stored in my brain, what I previously learned is what I am, then your consciousness, working together with your subconsciousness and chemical brain consciousness, very much can change the outcome of the universe, and it can change itself. So basically, one example is if you notice that you're depressed, your brain chemistry is out of whack. What you will do then is you go to a psychotherapist, you take some pills to get that chemistry into balance again. That's essentially what you do, and now you've changed the brain chemistry, and you've changed the deterministic system that shapes your brain.
So your brain was determined to take an action, and that action had an impact on other parts of your brain, and you're calling that free will.
Yeah, I mean, but your brain always evaluates what's going on around it, and so your brain notices, oh wait, I'm not feeling motivated, I'm feeling down, I'm depressed. I need to. This is not in line with my goals, so I need to take counteractions. And it's the same for an AI, like a self-driving car. When it notices, oh, I'm slipping because I'm on ice, what can I do? I need to take counteractions. It did not foresee the ice. The ice was deterministic or it was random. That doesn't matter. But if it's especially if it's random, then what the car does and the coping mechanisms developed are its freedom to influence the world. And this is not this is the most important part to me of this randomness. This is in no way, shape, and form determined by the parameters going in. So no matter if you know every position, every detailed info of all the state of the universe right now, you still cannot say what I will do in a month from now, just as you cannot predict the weather in 3 months from now with 100% accuracy. And this is exactly the beauty of the brain, that it looks at all these probabilities and tries to change them and influence them for its goal.
So,
I mean,
if there's a brain that desires food and it eats the food will then be processed into certain cell structures in the brain and change its neuroplasticity, which mice and rats and worms do, and bacteria do. Do bacteria have free will?
Yes, to a certain degree, certainly. I mean, this is why also the neuron, why I said before, the neuronal model of the brain alone does not explain everything we do, because there's
So when people
single cell amoeba that show non-predictable behavior when they are under attack, and that clearly try to avoid attackers when they're being attacked. So this is
yeah, but
very
they have
fundamental
no
to all biological
consciousness.
life.
They're not conscious. They don't have a brain.
I mean, the question is, are they conscious? Are they proto-conscious? But basically, this is what life is. That they, or what I say, why also a computer could develop free will. If you have different options, if nobody can predict which option you will take beforehand, that's what freedom is, right? I mean, maybe spin this around. What would be a definition of free will that would work for you? That you say is maybe physically impossible, but that would be free will to you.
Well, the ability for consciousness to actually have an impact on the things it does. So, like, if my consciousness can itself be the cause of my actions, that would be free will. I don't think it's possible. But if there was like a special kind of magic that was the consciousness magic, and it could cause me to do all of my actions and beliefs, then that would be free will.
But to which degree would you need this control? Do you say it's only if you have 100% control, or is 10% control enough? How much control does your consciousness need to have?
Any. So if there's a magic consciousness thing, and the magic consciousness thing has any percent of control, and that would be the percent of free will we have.
Yeah, and that's exactly what I'm arguing for, and
But
why I say
you said the
it's
consciousness
clear
has
from the
no
evidence we
effect.
have a certain percentage of this freedom, and what I'm hoping that science will look into more is really how much percentage do we have?
No, so I'm saying the consciousness has to be the cause. Now, in your example, the consciousness isn't the cause. The consciousness is an effect. The consciousness is affected by the randomness and affected by its determined structure. And the combination of those two things can cause different effects to its structure, which can cause different effects to how it will change based off of the inputs it has. But
you have
none of that is
that cause your consciousness, and the consciousness itself then influences future
yeah, but
effects.
I want to know, how does the consciousness itself act as the cause with no prior information? If it's getting information from a random source, it's not the consciousness. If it's getting information from a determined source, it's not the consciousness. So how does a consciousness make a choice with no prior information?
Without information.
What?
Your consciousness without information really does not really make sense. I mean, if you
Yeah,
have no
that's
senses,
what you're saying.
no knowledge of the world around you, then you just
Well, no, I don't. You can start with all the prior knowledge. I don't care about that. So, how does a consciousness make a decision without being determined, not with getting no information from its determined causes? So, right, it doesn't have no prior knowledge, and getting no information from quantum randomness. How could a consciousness do anything if it wasn't one of those two things?
Yeah, but this is, in my opinion, a definition of consciousness. This is just not consciousness anymore.
Right.
Because what is our consciousness? We are conscious of everything that's going around us, that's going in us, our feelings.
Right. So
and based on that, our consciousness is then deciding what to do.
So right. Remember, the question is how does the consciousness cause itself? How does it make a decision that affects itself? And if the consciousness is making this decision based on external factors, like the information it gets from determined things or the information it gets from random things, then it's not making a decision that affects itself. It's being caused by other external factors that are not itself. So that would disprove your definition.
Causing external factors, right?
What do you mean causing external factors?
your consciousness clearly takes in external factors when it makes decisions and is
Yes,
at least to
it
some
takes in. How does
part
it cause? What
working
do what
like
do you
a
mean by it
neuron in a
causes
computer.
external factors?
Basically, if you make a conscious decision, it doesn't matter if this is magic or if this is purely computational. This decision then usually triggers action, and that action influences how the world will look in a few minutes and what
Oh yeah,
happens.
like if I pick up a shoe or something, I've affected the world. That's just what you mean.
Yeah, and basically the thing is, I think what you're saying is that basically you want this consciousness to really be disconnected, like in a soul from your brain to call it free will. But so for me, the question is more like, um, could anybody? So basically, if there was, so let's say you were a robot, and there's a guided program you that knows reads all the parameters that go into you, knows exactly what code you have, but you're the self-learning computer that is conscious, evaluates the world, looks at the world, and makes decisions, and has its own goals, and even develops its own goals. The question is, if this developer right now knows everything about you, has programmed you, has developed you, can he predict what you will do in a month from now? And I would say no, because of quantum randomness.
Well,
And this is
if you
essentially
to
your
know
freedom.
everything about you is irrelevant because you aren't the only factor. There are external factors. So, in order to predict
Yeah, of
everything
course.
that's going to happen, you need to know everything about you and everything that's going to happen external to you. So, for example, I could know everything about you, but I can't predict what you're going to do in a week because you could be hit by a car because I know nothing about like the car that could hit you, and that's all determined. So every factor in that is determined, but I don't know that if you're going to be hit by a car, because even if I know every single fact about you, I don't know every single fact about your environment. So even if you and your environment are determined and it is 100% certain you're going to be hit by a car tomorrow, I couldn't know that because to know that I need to know every fact about you plus every fact about the environment. So saying you know every fact about you is irrelevant here. The question
Yeah.
is how do you, your consciousness, have an impact? And if the consciousness can only have an impact which is a result of external things, like its determined processes or other random processes that affect the consciousness, and the consciousness isn't the cause. It's the consciousness is an effect.
Yeah, but if all these if if all these variables going in are not fully deterministic, and what your brain does, even if it was deterministic, I would say it isn't, but if your brain is deterministic and all does these, you your brain essentially has an influence, right? I'm sorry, my cat is just again destroying my office in the background. So this is basically what I was asking. And this is, I think, a misunderstanding because if it was magical, not physical, that your consciousness basically does whatever it does, independent of all its brain chemistry, okay, yeah, that would definitely be free will, but it would also definitely be impossible. But just if you look at what your consciousness actually does, it looks at everything that's going on around it, tries to estimate what will happen in a few seconds from now and a few months, a few years, depending on how long you plan right now, and then find decisions to give you the best outcome. And these decisions are not fully determined by the variables going in, and especially over time, what your consciousness does, the processing consciousness also determines what the future variables going in will be.
Yes, but again, that has nothing to do with free will. So, for example, if a computer is just looking in a direction and it gets sensory information, and that sensory information is saved to memory, and some of the memory is jostled by quantum fluctuations, and so it's changed, and then based on that memory, it has to do something like turn a different direction, then the new information it's getting is going to be determined by those other forces. So the computer is determined to look through the camera gives it information, the information is saved to memory, the memory is hit by random fluctuations, and then those random fluctuations then cause the camera to turn in a different direction, which affects what it's sensing, its external input in the world, or it can like push an object or something, so it can affect the world too. None of that is free. None of that is free will. Even if the computer can then say, based off of what it's doing or what it's looking, the new information it's saving will cause a new program to emerge or whatever, still not free will.
I mean, it's the simplest form of free will, I would say. Yes. I mean, it's not really free in that the computer does not choose its goals and it cannot deviate from the path. But as soon as you give the computer the option to also influence its own programming based on what it sees around, then it very quickly becomes free will. And the more complex it is, the more free it is.
No amount of complexity here adds any free will to it whatsoever. All it is you are determined to, based off of the things that that affect your brain, to change in specific ways, which then affect your brain. So something external to you, either the quantum randomness or the determines, affects your brain. Input comes in. That input affects your brain and changes it to do other stuff, which the other stuff also affects your brain. None of that is you. None of that is your consciousness. There's no conscious impact that you have in any of that at all.
I mean, I try to, I think I see where you're rubbing against, and I'm trying to how I can explain to you why I think that's a misunderstanding. Let's look at the simplest part. There's single-celled amoeba that exhibit behavior that I would call free will. That basically, if you spray water at these amoeba, they feel attacked and they either hold still and play dead, or they detach from the surface they were on and go away. And it's not. Scientists have tried to determine to predict this behavior, but they can't. It's like really 50-50 what each individual amoeba will do. Now the question is, you spray this water on the amoeba, that's what you do, and the amoeba reacts. The question is, this decision, it's life or death for the amoeba, to detach or to play dead. Is that free will or not?
No.
And why not?
Because it is 100% determined what the amoeba is going to do based off of either the determined biology or the quantum randomness that is not the amoeba. Neither of those things are the amoeba. So everything the amoeba is going to do is 100% determined by external forces to the amoeba.
Yeah, but apparently it is not, because if it was,
our ability to measure it is irrelevant. So you're confusing our. Wait, no,
right?
no, that's wrong. So when I say it's completely determined, what I mean is that what the amoeba is going to do is 100% affected by the other things around the amoeba. So if the quantum randomness is random, so we don't know if the quantum randomness is going to affect the amoeba, but if it does, then the amoeba is going to move. So if the quantum randomness hits the amoeba will move with 100% certainty. So the quantum randomness affects the amoeba, it will 100% move. If the quantum...
No, that's actually, the amoeba with 50% does move or does not move, and you cannot predict which. That's exactly the point about it.
No, this is the whole point I'm trying to explain to you that you're confusing. So the quantum randomness here is random. The amoeba is not random. So the amoeba, if the quantum randomness occurs, the switch will flip. The amoeba will move. The amoeba is 100% determined by the switch. And the quantum randomness is random, but the switch is determined. The amoeba is the switch. The amoeba is 100% determined, and the quantum randomness is what isn't. So the
question is, how does the amoeba then make this decision? Because it
doesn't decide anything.
Exactly,
it's purely
perfectly
it's switch.
Random.
The switch. There's a switch in the amoeba. The switch is affected by the quantum randomness. The amoeba does nothing but just be affected by the switch.
Yeah, but basically in this case, the switch is the amoeba itself, right?
No one says that. The switch is the quantum randomness. The switch, well, yes, the switch is the amoeba, but what's flipping the switch, the quantum randomness, that part which is not determined, is not the amoeba. So the amoeba is 100% determined. The quantum randomness outside of the amoeba is not determined, and it's what causes it to move or not move.
That's a bit of a problem, because it's not actually distinguishable if it's the amoeba or not, right? Because for all we know, the decision is completely, the 50-50 decision to detach or not is completely made inside the amoeba.
No.
From outside probing, we cannot predict it. That's what these experiments show.
You're confusing epistemology and ontology. None of what we know matters. The amoeba is 100% determined. What matters is the fact that there is quantum randomness there that we can't measure is irrelevant. The amoeba is determined by the randomness, not the other way around.
Yeah, but if the randomness is inside the amoeba, then the randomness is part of the amoeba, right?
No. The fact that there's a random particle decay in my head doesn't mean that the particle decay is me.
Yeah, well, this is then interesting, because then what are you if you're not what's going on in your head?
I am the consciousness in my head. I am the thoughts, the experiences. There are things that are not, like particles flowing through my head. That's not me. They're just neutrinos are in my head for a billionth of a second. That's not me. They can hit my neuron and cause a conscious sensation, like the guy who put his head in front of a particle collider and had a giant flashing light show up for him, the particles were not him, even though they caused him to have an experience. So there is an external factor that was not him that hit his brain and caused him to have a sensory experience. That's the quantum fluctuation. The quantum fluctuation is an external thing which is not the brain, and it causes something in the brain.
Yeah, I think I understand where the thing where we are have different opinions, because basically if I go into what you're just saying and what am I actually, then I would have to bring up Penrose, and that's basically an interesting part, but I wanted to keep it for a little bit later, because this is where we go to the borders of science, where I'm not like able to point to fixed science, because this is basically what's still unknown. But I would say basically what we know is that if you say your brain is a black box and the U is inside, for all we know that U, or in that case the amoeba's U, is what determines its behavior, and not only the outside parameters. The outside parameters influence it, but are not enough to explain the behavior, which is where I say that there must be a bit of freedom and free will
How
involved.
could you ever be considered the quantum randomness? So if I took a uranium 238 molecule and injected it into your brain, does that make you now more free because it's going to cause random stuff to occur in your brain with a higher rate?
I mean, what Roger Penrose argues is that basically your brain is partially classical and partially a quantum computer. But I mean, let's look at what randomness
Well,
actually
that
is, because
actually
basically,
that makes more sense. So you're claiming that there's a quantum computer in your brain. Okay, but the way a quantum computer works is that it measures quantum things that are not in the computer. The quantum
yeah,
effects are not the computer; they're outside of the computer, right?
yeah, I'll try to explain it. Basically, I wanted to first explain that I see a classical computation way with randomness to get free will, but you basically reject that idea. So let's get into that, the quantum consciousness idea. And basically, quantum consciousness has been proposed for a long time, that quantum effects have a fundamental role in consciousness. Just scientists have not fully settled on one theory. I personally like ORCHA-R by Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff best, and it's also in a 2019 review study by Lee et al. They also found that it's, and I quote, undoubtedly the ORCHA-R theory co-established by theoretical physicist Penrose and neuroscientist Hameroff is currently the most convincing theory. So this is the best, but it's not settled. And it goes back to basically, how does a quantum particle actually make a decision? Because if you look at quantum randomness, say what I wanted to bring up before, the double slit experiment. If you shoot electrons at two slits and you don't measure, they go to both slits and behave like a wave. But as soon as you measure to which slit it goes, you force the particle to make a decision, and it goes to only one and acts like a particle. And the interesting thing is that this has a perfect 50-50 correlation. And there's experiments like the Bell experiment that show that really, for all we know, the decision is not determined by anything external to the particle. So really the particle makes the decision. And the interesting thing is, in the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum physics, they say, oh yeah, it's just random. But sorry, they don't actually explain how randomness works, because, I mean, we can flip a coin or throw a dice or something if we want to have a probabilistic outcome, but the particle does not have these tools. And what nobody explained to this day is really like how the particle comes up with a random choice. Does it know what all the other particles do and then just choose something they didn't, or how does it do it? And what Roger Penrose says is no, really, the particle decides. So each individual particle, when it is forced to make a decision to go to one or the other slit, decides um, to go left or right. And since these, to the particle, these probabilities are equal, each particle has a 50-50 chance which choice it makes. And what Penrose then says is basically, and if there's a way to entangle and to basically, he said, calls it orchestrate a lot of these quantum events together, you then can basically get a complex consciousness. Basically, each particle has a very simple proto-consciousness that gives it the ability to decide left or right. And if you have a lot of these quantum events bounded together and orchestrated together, you can get a very complicated consciousness. Basically, consciousness is the quantum randomness, is what he says.
So entangling the particles is the consciousness. Yeah, I can understand the argument. The problem is that uh, A quantum computer doesn't entangle any of the particles. It's just reading the particles. The particle is
Yeah,
there, and it's
quantum
just
computer is the rough analogy. I mean,
right,
it's
right. So
not
just going just
exactly like a quantum computer in the lab, but
so what you're saying is that in order to have free will, you need to entangle the particles of the quantum randomness in the system.
as I said before, I already as I see a mechanistic definition of free will, but for the strongest free will that we apparently exhibit, it's very likely that a computer uses quantum effects not just indirectly but also directly, and this is what Penrose tries to describe there. Basically, consciousness in the end is composed out of these quantum events. Is what he says basically.
Okay, so you're saying that free will is a bunch of particles in your brain that have been quantumly entangled and their random decays therefore cause a composite effect on stuff in your brain.
More or less, yes. I mean, if you go back
Okay,
to
wait,
the
wait,
to the
wait. No,
example with the
keep stick with
yeah
that. Okay, so how does your
yeah
brain entangle the particles?
yeah. So the theory by Penrose and Hameroff postulates that basically inside each neuron there are so-called microtubules, and these microtubules are basically are the basically the qubits of this quantum computer. And as I said, this is all
So it's
this is
determined.
no, it isn't.
Like the way that the neurons entangle particles is 100% determined by the physical shape of the neurons.
Now, what he's saying is basically inside each neuron, there's thousands of microtubules, and these microtubules are actually what does the processing and what determines if a neuron fires or does not fire, and that these are basically interconnected in the brain through quantum entanglement or
How
orchestration, as he
does the
calls it.
brain entangle two particles?
That's basically on the
Oh,
fringes
I don't
of the
need like
experimentation.
a 100%. This is just hypothetically any possible way you can think of. I don't. You can pick anything you want here. I'm not trying to argue the science here. What I'm saying is that any way that the brain is going to entangle two particles is going to either be determined. So like the physical shape of the neuron, there's like
Yeah,
one side of the neuron, if a particle is there, and the other side of a neuron, a particle is there, it entangles those two neurons. And it's just based off of the shape of the neuron. The shape of the neuron determines that it entangles these two particles over here because they're in the correct location in the neurons to entangle them.
yeah, but what he's saying is basically the brain has this classical processing part that is the neuronal system, but it also has this the quantum part inside each neuron. So basically, if a neuron fires is determined by quantum processes, and these quantum processes are what consciousness is. And
Okay,
they
so
are obviously
in a
quantum random and
brain,
not predicted.
so in a brain, a neuron will entangle two particles because 100% determined by the shape of the neuron. It will entangle particles based off of the shape of the neuron.
He's actually saying microtubules, which is inside the neuron, which also solves the problem with the amoeba, which does not have neurons.
So that's also part of in everything inside the neuron is the shape of the neuron. Shape it doesn't just mean the circumference. Every physical structure in the neuron is the shape of the neuron.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so what causes the particles to be entangled is the shape of the neuron, and what causes the particles to enter those positions in the neuron is quantum randomness.
Yeah, but what each of these particles or microtubules does is basically not deterministic, but probabilistic. And basically, whenever a quantum collapse happens in these microtubules, that's actually what he calls a conscious event. And all these events combined together is what Penrose calls consciousness.
Right, so you have a physical neuron, which is completely 100% determined by its shape, and then inside of the physical neuron, there are these quantum random events. And so it's exactly like my analogy I started with. You have a computer with a switch, which is determined by quantum randomness, either it flips on or off, and it's reading if this other switch is on or off that will allow the first switch to flip on or off. So you have two random quantum events in the neuron, and the neuron is completely 100 physically determined to read these two events, and as long as these two events coincide in some way, causes the neuron to fire.
Yeah, but in this case, he actually postulates that the randomness is not randomness, but actually a conscious decision. So basically, when a quantum collapse happens, the particle has to make a decision. And I said, okay, if you can influence this position, this is free will. And Roger Penrose goes beyond and he says, actually, the quantum collapse itself is consciousness.
Okay,
And
but your consciousness.
where
All I
free
care
will
about,
lies.
all that matters is your consciousness. So my idea of a pink elephant right now, that doesn't have anything to do with the collapsing quantum particles in my neurons. That idea is not have any effect on my choices. It's the only effect is the consciousness of the collapsing particles in my neurons. Okay, but the pink elephant in my head doesn't. That doesn't do anything.
Yeah, what he says is you are these, as your conscious is the collapse
I'm
of
just talking about
these
the pink
things.
elephant. So I don't care about all the
Yeah,
different neurological quantum fluctuations in every
yeah,
neuron in
but
my brain.
the pink
Pink
elephant is
elephant.
the pink elephant in the end is you decided to think about a pink elephant, and your brain then basically puts together that image, and you have this image now in your consciousness. This is an interaction of all the part of your brain. So this is not you're consciously imagining a pink elephant relies on many parts of your brain, not just one.
Right. So if you're saying that we caused the collapse, I'm thinking of a pink elephant. How does my pink elephant cause the collapse?
Yeah, does it need to cause the collapse?
Yes, that's what you've been saying the entire time. That the consciousness is the
No,
causes the
the
choices.
collapse is always forced by by external influences. But what happens in the collapse is not determined. So basically, the particle in a double slit experiment, it does not decide to just collapse here. It only decides to collapse the wave function when it's measured, when it's poked from the outside. But
Right.
you then the particle decides to go left or right.
Right. So the particle, which is not you, is caused to collapse by external factors, which are not you, and those external factors then influence you to make a decision. But that wasn't you who influenced it. It was the external factors and the external particle, right?
Yeah, but let's see it from the particle's point of view.
Okay.
Would you say the particle, a quantum particle, if it's in this experiment, could have free will? If it's basically it's poked, it must decide, and it decides left or right, and outside influences don't decide whether it goes left or right. Just the particle itself decides it.
Well, I don't think free will is logically possible, so I don't know what that would mean. So what I'm trying to figure out here is there's a particle, it can quantum collapse with some probability. Okay, uh, it it collapses in our head. How exactly do you come to the conclusion that this particle is its random collapse is somehow apparently consciousness?
Yeah, but before we go into try to imagine that you are this one particle before you get into more complex. Try to imagine you are the particle and you make this decision left or right as the particle in the quantum collapse, and you're poked by outside influence to make the collapse, but none of the outside factors decides whether you go left or right. Is this a free will decision or not, in your opinion?
No, I'm gonna say it's either 100% determined by a not choice or 100% random by a not choice. The choice there does nothing. It accomplishes nothing. It's nothing.
But what is what is the random in the particle? So basically, where does the particle get the
A
random?
field is just I'd say it's a
What did
so I'd say it's
so you
exactly
say
like
an
everything else
external
in
field or
physics.
something dictates that the particle makes this decision?
Yeah, I'd say that randomness itself is a fundamental property like energy or mass or something like that. So it's a thing. Randomness itself is a thing that is not consciousness.
Yeah, but that's basically the debate that one could have here, because basically what we know from, I mean, there's some physicists that still try to argue for determinism, going even so far as saying superdeterminism is just not detectable, it's still determined. But all the experiments we did on it, like the Bell experiment, to see if the particle is influenced by outside factors, hidden variables, or outside field, always came up with no, it
Yeah,
really
I'm
wasn't
not arguing
influenced.
for super determinism. I'm saying
Yeah,
randomness itself is a thing, so it is truly
yeah.
random, but that thing isn't consciousness. So it's not the
But
collapse of the particle happens, it is completely random, it has nothing to do with consciousness.
but even if it's truly random, it's a local random. Basically, the random generator that generates in random numbers is inside the particles. That is what the particle does. It's not some external random number generator that tells the particle to flip left or right.
I don't know what you mean. The randomness itself is fundamental to the universe, so it's external. It's not has nothing to do with our brains. It's like the electromagnetic field that causes the electrons to pass around the protons has nothing to do with us. It's not. It's not. We didn't create the electromagnetic field. We didn't create the random field either.
The thing is, where is but we don't have detected any random field or something, because what you're saying, basically the random field would basically nudge the particle into making this decision, because basically this 50-50 decision, it somehow has to be made.
Yeah.
And it looks to be perfectly random.
Yeah.
And there's only two ways to explain this with that current physics. Either the particle size has a perfect random number generator inside, which would raise many, many questions, or what Penrose says, maybe the particle just does a proto-conscious decision, and
no, so
given that
that's
the particle
false
just
dichotomy.
decides.
There's false dichotomy. So there could be infinitely many causes to the randomness thing, which are not consciousness, have nothing to do with consciousness. So slapping consciousness on it does nothing. It's just a gap filler, a god of the gaps. You're saying, we can't explain it consciousness, but consciousness doesn't explain anything there. Saying that consciousness is it doesn't explain the random number generator at all. I could say it's a pineapple. It's a magical pineapple.
Where is this a false dichotomy? Is that there's either the perfect random generator, which would be really hard to explain, or it's a proto-conscious decision by the particle.
Proto-consciousness is not an explanation. I could say proto-potato, and that would be equally as much of an explanation as proto-consciousness.
But basically, I think you say that the random number generator is a physical law of the universe, and Penrose says no, consciousness is a physical law of the universe.
Yeah, and we could say a potato is a physical law of the universe. You can make up any noun you want and claim it's the fundamental nature of randomness.
But the thing is that basically, if you say it's consciousness, as Penrose says, it's a much easier explanation than the random generator, because the random generator is much
the
more
random
complex.
Generator
consciousness is actually
no. So
just
wait.
So observe.
Wait, hold on. So the random number generator is there no matter what. There is always going to be a random number generator, and Penrose explains the random number generator as a proto-consciousness. I explain the random number generator as some fundamental field of some kind. And you could explain the random number generator as a magical potato in every single neuron. There's always going to be that thing. The random thing is there, no matter what. We all agree that. The quasis is what exactly is it? Penrose thinks it's consciousness. There's nothing to support that. I think it's some field of some kind that seems significantly more plausible. Why do you think the consciousness is a better explanation than just a field?
That's because consciousness. So basically, you're right. The random generator is always there somehow, and we need to explain how it works. And a field, if it's an external field, that would somehow be observable, surely. And we don't have any hint to see that there's a random field. Because basically all the tests we did to see if there's any correlation between the random decisions of all these particles always came up blank.
No, so
but
that's,
consciousness is actually
wait. So that's false. So it's false. First thing is that there could be infinitely many fields that exist that we can't detect. If there's a field that is 40 orders of magnitude weaker than gravity, we will not be able to detect it. So if there could be lots and lots of fields we can't detect, not in any way an issue. So the question here is that how does saying the randomness is caused by a proto-consciousness in any way count as a more reasonable explanation than it's some unknown field?
I mean, basically, the unknown field, we don't have any evidence.
We don't have any evidence for consciousness
either. For consciousness, we have evidence that we are conscious.
Okay, we have evidence I'm conscious, but what evidence do we have that consciousness has anything to do with the random collapse of particles in neurons?
Yeah, basically, the chain of logic goes this, because we know that we are conscious, and we can go to the simplest life forms like amoeba that have none of all that we have in the brain, but these microtubules have no neurons or something, and they also exhibit behavior that is similar to conscious decisions or to quantum randomness decisions. So basically, this effect, this seemingly random, not outside determined decision that we see in quantum effect, effects is a fundamental difference between what we see in life forms behavior and what we see in like macro objects like stones. And the only link that connects basically a quantum random event, an amoeba's behavior, and our behavior is would be if all of them are in some way the same. That's the logic behind it.
Why would that have anything to do with consciousness? So, for example, we can see the exact same random collapse things occur in non-conscious, non-living things. The randomness occurs all over the place. So, it's why would you assume that because there are living things that can be affected by the consciousness, that the randomness itself is conscious? So it seems far more simple and parsimonious to say that the randomness is there as some kind of a field, and the conscious things and the neurons in the living things can read it and are not the cause of it.
That would also work, but then you basically what you call random field then would be basically a consciousness field.
Well, no, that's begging the question. So we both agree that the randomness is there. The question is the randomness consciousness or not? And so why would we conclude that it is consciousness is the question? You're just labeling it and defining it as consciousness is begging the question.
The question is what if the field is involved in what we do in consciousness, you can also call it a consciousness field. And if the random field is something completely different, if say there's hidden perfect random number generator somewhere that is with using an invisible field tells all particles what to do. In the end, the outcome is the same, looks the same.
Well, yeah,
which is why it's
I'm
not
totally fine with that.
from each other.
The problem is that the field also affects other things that aren't conscious. So the field affects conscious things and rocks, like you mentioned. So it's more reasonable to conclude that it's not consciousness, that there's some field there, and that it affects conscious things, but it also affects non-conscious things. So
that's the difference between live and dead things. The dead things just have the quantum effects happen to them, and they don't do anything that we can determine to change what happens with them. And living things actually actively try to change the outcomes. That's basically agency. That's the difference between life and not life. That basically life tries to that life does stuff actively, while non-life things
uranium
don't do
238
stuff.
also is affected by the randomness, and it's dead, non-living.
Yeah, but inside the uranium, it's just a quantum collapse, and that's it.
Yeah. So there are there's a rock, and the rock has uranium 238 in it. And uranium 238 decays, and it causes other argon atoms to decay further. So the rock is affected by the quantum randomness. The rock has no consciousness in it.
Yeah, but the rock has no effect on the on the decays.
Right. So the randomness is there. There is no consciousness there. So it's more reasonable to think that the randomness is some fundamental field that has nothing to do with consciousness, and consciousness is just reading that field. So the same argument you're making could be made about light. So when we see light, or when living things see light without any quantum randomness, they react to it. Like we go towards the light or whatever. When a rock sees light, it does nothing. Does that mean that light is fundamental to the rock or to the consciousness? No. We see it, but it's there without us at all. Like the photons have nothing to do with consciousness, even though they only cause conscious things to interact or to act in a certain way. They obviously, the rocks don't care about the photons, right? So
but you have to explain what is the difference between the rock. Why does the rock not do something, and why does the living being do something when they see the light?
Because it has a way to read and react to the light. So there's a process within the object which causes it to react in a way that doesn't exist in the other object. So the analogy here I'm making is that if we're comparing living and non-living things that react to some input, like a photon or a randomness generator, your argument is that because it only seems to have an effect on conscious things, therefore it's reasonable to conclude that that thing itself is consciousness. Whereas if we use that exact same reasoning, we could conclude that photons are themselves consciousness. Or
no, the logic is the quantum thing does something that the conscious thing also does, and we have no explanation for both, but they look similar, so they might be the same thing.
What is the quantum thing does something the conscious thing does?
The quantum thing does something. It is not predictable. it really does a completely random coin flip, left or right. And things, even simple live things like the amoeba, also do this, exhibit behavior that seems to be fundamentally non-predictable. And the rock doesn't, which is why it seems like
Wait,
maybe
the rock
this difference.
The rock does do those things. Remember, uranium-238 is in the rock. Uranium-238 decays, and then there's an argon atom next to it, which then is hit by the decaying electron or proton out of the uranium, and it decays at a seemingly random rate. So it also is affected by the randomness. What's the
Yeah, but
difference?
the rock itself does not affect the randomness.
Right? So how do we affect the randomness?
Yeah, apparently what is we, like in the amoeba, does affect the randomness. It does either this or that, and it changes its behavior based on the outcome variables in a way that's not predictable.
The argon changes its behavior in a way that's not predictable too. How is that different from the amoeba?
Uh, the argon does just decay. It's just a
No.
quantum
So
effect.
the uranium-238 decays, and the decayed atom hits the argon, and then the argon
Yeah,
decays. So the argon is, we can't predict it. We cannot measure the exactly when it's going to decay. We can't do it. We have no idea. We just know that when the uranium-238 decays in the rock, it's going to cause the argon to decay at a
yeah,
random.
but the argon decay itself is one of these quantum events, right?
No, I'm using that as a separate thing. So it has nothing to do with quantum events. It's just hit by a flying electron, which causes it to decay. So no, it's purely determined, not random at all.
Yeah, I don't really understand, because basically the argument is that all the random conscious events are similar to what conscious beings do. So they might do that. So this is why they might be the same, and you're just trying to argue that they are the same, but they are
No, so I'm
basically
saying that we grant there is some random event, like a particle decaying, and that random event can cause a determined reaction, like a different particle being hit by the decayed atom. Um, and in the same way, we have a random event in an amoeba. We don't understand how this could happen. And so if we look at the amoeba and say, well, here's a random event we can't explain, and then we look at the argon and say, here's a random event we can't explain, they could both
but
be
the difference is
100% determined, but what's going on is there's some other underlying external random event which caused both of those, which is not intrinsic in the thing itself.
the difference is basically what you're saying. So the argon gets, so a quantum decay happens, hits the argon, and the argon decays, and a jet of water hits the amoeba, and the amoeba either freezes or detaches. But that's exactly the difference, because the argon hit by the electron decays. It's deterministic. You know what happens when the electron hits the argon. But the amoeba, you can do it all over and over again, and you do not
Well,
know
so
what the
we're
amoeba will do.
granting the or theory here. We're saying that in the amoeba there are neurons, and the neurons have the
Yeah,
whatever they're called, the corpuscles, something. The what are they things? The things that can measure the entanglement.
the microtubules is what
Microtubules.
their
Yes.
theory.
So
It might be something different, but
yeah,
just
we're granting
granted
it.
that
We're granting it
its
for the sake of the
quantum
argument.
effect is
So
involved. Yeah.
the amoeba has a neuron, the neurons have the microtubules, and the microtubules are affected by the quantum randomness. So the quantum randomness is there. It hits the microtubules, and the microtubules are the water. So it's not the
The quantum
determined.
randomness actually does not hit the microtubules. The microtubules is what he proposes are in a superposition state of two possible states, and then they collapse. And this event of the collapse is basically what he calls his consciousness, this decision into which of two
Right.
possible
So I'm
states
saying there's an
to
alternative theory here. So
flip.
the alternative theory here is that the microtubules are hit by an external random thing. And when
Yeah.
they're hit, they cause the neuron to collapse or to react in a certain way, which causes the amoeba to break off. So the amoeba is 100% determined, just like the argon. There is an external random thing, which is inside the neurons. The microtubules are hit by this randomness factor, which is completely external to the amoeba. And this randomness factor causes the amoeba to then either break off or not break off or whatever. So just like the randomness could be explained by this fundamental consciousness thing, which doesn't seem to make any sense. It could also be explained by there is an external thing, which is a field of randomness, and there's something in the amoeba which is hit by this randomness.
Yeah. But so basically, I think I understand now. I say, and yeah, this. I mean, the problem is that if it's consciousness or some other randomness field, it's not distinguishable from the effect. But in the end, if you say basically, if you say that the effect that decides where in which way of two options the collapse goes, if you say that is consciousness, then you say, okay, this is basically intrinsic. This is the decision, and guarantee free will. If you say this is an external field that is random, wherever the random numbers come, it gives you this random number, and then it's external. But this would then raise basically the question: what is this random field, or what is the random number generator behind this field? Because in the end, then it would still somehow be basically, because then you have this random field, random generator that determines all the universe. And this is why I say this is the to me this is the bigger jump in assumptions, because basically now you have to explain what is this field, where does it come from, how does it get its random number, how does it control the whole universe. Which, if
Yeah,
it's just a local phenomenon, is a much simpler explanation than they are. Both are possible, yeah. But in the end, if your option is true, that it just raises many more questions. But in the end,
yeah,
so
that's exactly right. So the argument here is an analogy to lightning 2,000 years ago. If we say lightning is caused by a magical god being, a magical mind,
yeah,
oh, well, that's easy to explain. If you're saying it's caused by some other field we can't explain yet, that raises a lot of questions. It's hard to explain what lightning is 2,000 years ago.
yeah,
But it's 100% not a god Zeus being. That was just an anthropocentric application of our feels that we like to think there's, or we're special and our minds are special, and we take that and impose it as an explanation of an unknown. That seems to be the same thing that Penrose is doing here, and that this idea that consciousness is, he's
yeah,
just taking, we like consciousness, we're going to impose that as a god of the gaps on this new fundamental property. And it's a much better explanation to say, nah, it's probably just going to be a fundamental field of some kind, because that seems to be every discovery we've ever made is a non-conscious field of some kind.
yeah. But yeah, or you could call it the consciousness field. But this is basically what I say. No, this is not a god of the gaps. Quite contrary, and which is why basically it's commonly agreed that quantumness is somehow involved in our brain, in consciousness. This is most scientists agree that
Quantumness is
somehow,
involved in everything. Literally,
yeah.
quantum randomness
No,
effect
but,
is
but
everything.
basically that this the quantum effect of the quantum collapse is somehow involved in consciousness is what many scientists think. It's just hard to determine exactly how
Right.
and
I mean,
why.
everyone agrees with that.
But
It affects everything. But
the thing is, what you're saying is that basically Penrose, in his way, how he brings it in, is committing a God of the gaps fallacy. And that's
yep.
what I say, not really, because um, there are only these two options. Either the particle itself makes the decision, which would be consciousness or proto-consciousness or whatever you want to call it, or it's an external field, like you say, that forces this decision. And since basically both are equally likely, although the internal is probably with locality and all the other physical laws, probably one that's easier to justify, where you have less assumptions to take. But either way, both could be likely.
Well, I mean,
Penrose
even
then
if
said, basically, Penrose not only says, okay, I have only know about this collapse, but he says basically, okay, but we see that a thing similar to this collapse happens in all living organisms, in their behavior, in their conscious behavior, and even in the probably not conscious
well, the
amoeba.
only thing that's
So
similar is we can't explain it. That's an argument from ignorance. We can't explain it. It's similar that we can't explain this and we can't explain that. Therefore, they're the same thing. It's argument from ignorance.
it's not that we can't explain it. It's that we know that we cannot determine it by just measuring the outside variables, that we know that some internal
No, we can't. We
characteristic in
can't
the
ever know that.
particle or in the amoeba.
We can't
Hmm?
ever know that. So we don't know everything about biology. So we can never know that we can't determine what the amoeba is going to do by knowing more about
Yeah, but
biology.
this is basically then you come in and then you can have super determinism,
For the
because
amoeba,
that's
there's no
basically,
super determinism. The amoeba is probably
yeah,
just
but
determined
for
by
the quantum
biology.
things, we really have done many tests to see, okay, it's really independently random.
No, for the
And
amoeba we haven't. We know
yeah,
nothing of
but no, but
biology.
for the quantum
Or
for the
right.
quantum
So
particles, we
I'm
did.
remember. So you're saying
And
that
for
there
the
is.
amoeba,
You're arguing that there's a similarity between the amoeba and the quantum
and
fluctuation.
yeah,
But I'm
and
saying
for the
no, you can't make that argument because we don't know enough
yeah,
about biology to claim that the amoeba is
no,
truly random.
no, but for the amoeba, we did the same test. I mean, we don't have as much evidence to say that it's completely independent of outside variables because yeah, there's much more variables, as I say. So it's harder to eliminate all other options because basically you can only eliminate other options. You cannot directly test for it being internal. But for all that we have done, it seems like it's internal to the amoeba, and it seems like it's internal. Our decisions are internal to our brain to some degree.
Well,
And
it's so that
this
again that
is
doesn't work at all. So you can't say we've tested a whole bunch of things that have failed, therefore it's magical randomness in the amoeba. Like no, because there's billions and billions of parts of biology we don't understand. There's absolutely nothing that you could conclude that the amoeba is
I did not
inherently
say
random.
that it's in any way random, magical, whatever. Just the way that you can test if something's internal or external. Since it's internal, you can never really test the internal decision making. Like in the quantum particle, you cannot ask the particle, did you make this decision? All you can do, and what science has done, is to try to, okay, in what ways could the universe, the physics, the known fields influence that particle? And then devise all the tests that we can do to find out if the decision is local inside the particle by an unknown mechanism,
I don't. I'm talking
or
about
if
the
it's
amoeba here. I don't care about the
outside
particle.
influence.
So the
Yeah,
amoeba,
but the amoeba is the
obviously,
same
there's
principle. You
we're,
can test.
no. That's the problem. It's not. There's no analogy here. Anybody who makes this analogy is a dumbass. So you can't say that the amoeba is random at all. The only reasonable conclusion is that the amoeba is determined by some biological fact inside of it. There is some particle connection inside the amoeba which causes this to occur. It's not random
Yeah,
at all. It's only apparent
you're saying it
randomness.
inside the amoeba. You can
Yeah.
test whether the amoeba is a black box, the particle is a black box. You can test, is outside influence making the decision, or is inside influence making the decision? Some
Every
process
action by a
inside the amoeba.
biological system is going to be done by internally in the biological system. It doesn't make your argument any
Yeah.
better. So the
No,
amoeba
exactly. And then when you look inside what's going on in the amoeba, we don't really find where it lies that it makes this decision. And
argument from ignorance.
Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff have looked on all the possible things where this could
Argument from
land. Said
ignorance. You can't ever
microtubules
say that.
seem to be where this decision making lies,
Argument from
and
ignorance.
then
You
they
can't ever say
postulate
that.
them. No, it's
You
not
can't
an
ever say
argument from
we've looked.
ignorance.
We don't understand everything, even close to everything about biology. You cannot, in any rational way, conclude the amoeba
But
is random.
hey, sorry. What they did is exactly how science goes on. They say, okay, we don't understand this, so we try to find out, can it be this? No, 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 no. In the end, they come up, okay, it's probably in the microtubules, and it's probably quantum randomness
No, you
inside the
can't ever say that. It's
microtubules.
nothing. Nowhere in science does it ever. That's the exact. It's called the Sherlock Holmes fallacy. You're saying that if we rule out all of the possibilities, only what is the most. If we rule out everything that's impossible, only the most. Whatever. I forget what the quote is exactly, but it's the Sherlock Holmes fallacy. We know for a fact this kind of reasoning fails and is not accepted in science anywhere, nowhere. So you can't rule out the possibilities because we don't know all the possibilities. You can rule out the known things, but then saying you have this new hypothesis of microtubules, which has no evidence to support it whatsoever, and saying
It
that
has evidence for so basically they already did some tests, and it's not fully confirmed, but as that 2019 review said, it's currently the best hypothesis or theory we have, and
yeah, as far as I
there
know,
is
there has no.
currently a
You'll
clinical
have to present
study
the evidence to me. But as far as
ongoing
I know, there's
testing
no
for it.
evidence. There's no evidence of microtubules actually existing. They're just hypothetical, and so their
No.
hypothetical explanation doesn't do anything other than say I can explain X.
Microtubules exist. It's hypothetical if they are where consciousness lies. So we
The
have them.
the quantumness randomness thingy is the part I'm. Yeah,
Yeah,
the
and so
so saying that these have this magical property of consciousness has no evidence. Zero.
I think where you're wrong is basically ruling out all other options in science to find where we have to look is something that's done. You cannot make a conclusion just from that, but that's done all the time. That you rule out if you're not sure how something works. That's also how you find an error if you like if the engine if something fails in a complex system like a robot. But always what you do is you rule out all the options until you say, okay, it must be there. and then you directly probe, and that's exactly what I
No,
did.
that only
Rule
applies
out,
with systems that you have all the variables for. If you don't have all the variables, that's a completely waste of time other than to build a hypothesis. So no, that doesn't count as
we
evidence.
never know all the variables, but this is what they did. They built this
In an
hypothesis by looking
engine,
at this
you
and
do
drawing this
in an engine,
analogy.
you
And
know
what they
all the variables.
currently
So in an engine, you
no,
can
you
say
don't.
there are this many pistons, there are this many screws. You can figure out it's one of those physical parts. You know all of the variables in a human robot. You don't know all the variables in biology. You can't rule everything out in biology. All you can say is, here are the things we know about. It's none of those. Whatever else it
Yeah,
is
but in the
question mark.
robot, there's also a lot that you never know, especially if the robot is actually programming itself, self-learning. There's a lot you don't know about it.
If a physical robot that we designed, we know everything about it. And the only kinds of systems that we can apply the reverse engineering to by saying it's not this, not this, not this, are the ones we know everything about. That's it.
No, it's actually what we do in biology. We try to do the same reverse engineering with biological systems. And we've learned much about human consciousness and human sensory perception by
So
actually
again, this is called the
trying to
Sherlock
get
Holmes
robots
fallacy.
to
Sherlock Holmes
exhibit
fallacy.
the
Google
same
it. You cannot
behaviors.
do that. If you're doing that, you're just
Yeah,
doing bad science.
no. This is not Sherlock Holmes fallacy at all. This is what I said. You use this to find where it's plausible that the thing lies, and then you hypothesize where could the error be and how can I detect the error, and that's what they did. And right now, this is what they do in clinical research. Basically, what they're doing is microtubules with various chemicals, especially anesthetics, and try to find out, okay, um, what happens to microtubules and to consciousness if we do this and this and that, and try to figure out by this, okay, this to prove that A, consciousness lies inside the microtubules, and B, to understand how exactly it works. But that's actually what you're doing. As I said, it's not a proven hypothesis, but it's not a complete wild card either. It's there is a lot of reasoning behind it that basically they've narrowed it down that probably quantum effects are involved in consciousness and
No, that's
neurons.
begging the question. They're definitely not. There's zero evidence of that whatsoever. Microtubules, like we obviously know quantum effects have effects on biology, and if you want to call those microtubules, fine. There is zero evidence that has anything to do with consciousness. Zero. None at all. It's completely made up. Now, the question is the quantum
You should
randomness.
read Roger Penrose's book, At the Emperor's New Mind, probably. There is evidence because there's effects, there's behaviors that we humans can do that a computer can't, that suggest that we have some quantum computing capabilities in our brains. Because there's just things that we cannot get a computer to do that humans and even much simpler
Anytime you
life
say
forms do
cannot
easily.
is an argument from ignorance. Anytime you say it's impossible, it's an argument from ignorance. Anytime you say we can't, it's all of these things have been ruled out, it's an argument from ignorance. So we can never rule everything out. Cannot be done. No.
Yeah, but it's always like we don't understand this. What might it be? Might it be this option? No, it is not this option. This. So probably it's this option. That's what they did.
Yeah, that's a Sherlock Holmes fallacy.
That's what all science does.
No, that's not exact. No, what science does is it makes novel predictions. You say if you can use that method to come up with a hypothesis, and you have to confirm the hypothesis independently. That method is not evidence. That method is just a way to come up with hypotheses. So,
Yeah, but that's exactly how we came up with the knowledge that very
no,
likely quantum
that's a way to
effects are
come up with a
truly
hypothesis.
random.
So you got the scientific method wrong here. What happens is that you use that method to come up with a hypothesis, then you have to have some independent
Yeah,
confirmatory
and
evidence of
then
the
you test
hypothesis.
this hypothesis, which
Right.
is what they're doing. But
So,
this
so
is
that
how we
method on
come
its
up with
own
hypotheses
isn't
all the
evidence.
time. And if something's not directly testable, like quantum randomness, in the end, we only have the option to rule out all other options.
That's a Sherlock Holmes fallacy. You cannot use that as evidence. You can use it as a hypothesis builder. You cannot use it as evidence. So saying that you're ruling out alternatives to come up with hypotheses is perfectly reasonable. Saying that you've ruled them out, therefore your evidence of your hypothesis, completely Sherlock Holmes fallacy.
Yeah, that's not what I said. This is I explained how they came up with, and I just tried to explain how they are testing for it.
Okay, so yeah, those are two
But
separate
you
things.
come up with a hypothesis
So
by
how they came up
excluding
with it
other
doesn't
options,
matter.
by
If
comparing things that go on. This is exactly
coming
how
up with a
done.
hypothesis isn't evidence. So how you come up with a hypothesis doesn't matter. You can just dream it up, and that's equally as good as a hypothesis builder. So
yeah,
that's not evidence of anything. The fact that you can rule things out isn't evidence of anything. What would be evidence is this independent method of confirmation. That would be evidence.
yeah. There is, as I said, there is testing going on for 20 years or something. It's not to the point where we say, okay, we're certain that it is, but we're at the point where even some papers write that it's the best theory we have. And this is always all we have, the best theory. We're never certain.
Yeah, there's no best theory. That's just a guy's opinion. So there isn't a best theory on this at all. Um, but so the problem here is that claiming
But
that
quantum, the theory of relativity by Einstein is also the best theory we have, and we know
or
we
isn't the
know
best theory.
definitely it's not
Or is
correct.
his opinion. There's no best theory on consciousness. It doesn't occur. It doesn't exist. It's just a theory. So the obviously Einstein's general relativity is the best theory. It's been confirmed. Until you have that kind of level of confirmation, you don't have a best theory. You just have a theory. So there isn't a best theory of consciousness. That's just a person's opinion that is the best theory. If until you get a consensus in neurology, probably, then it wouldn't count as a best theory.
I'm not sure. No, I think neurology is actually completely the wrong subject because we know that the neural computation model is not enough to explain what's going on.
Not enough argument from ignorance. So again, you have to
No,
go.
we know that we know that just the neuronal processing cannot explain consciousness. That's been ruled out, and that's been ruled out exactly by experiments like this, that we tested different levels of intelligence, like amoeba, what behaviors that we have do they also have, and like humans with brain damage, and we found out that basically you can lose a lot of what we thought was involved in consciousness and still be conscious, and that um, this is this is how we progress. We test.
None of that is disproven neurology
We
at all. None of that is proven that every conscious decision in the brain is 100% determined by neurological shape.
sorry, what?
None of that has disproven that neurology is the determining factor in consciousness.
No, but we know that the neural classical computer model alone does not explain what consciousness and our decision making.
So neurology would include
The
every
effects
physical
that we
feature in
see
the brain. So it's not
from
just
consciousness
it's
is
not
not.
just so neurology encompasses every physical part of the brain. That's the determining
Yeah,
factor. So even if there's smaller things that make up neurons, those would also be a part of neurology. So the neurological features of
yeah,
the
but
brain.
not normally not. I mean, yeah, but this is basically the field looking inside the neurons and looking what's going on there. And if that is where consciousness is, that is exactly the field that Stuart Hameroff and Roger Penrose are advancing and leading.
Right. So that would still be neurology. Neurology is concerned with neurons and what makes them and how they
No, that's then
operate.
actually quantum biology.
Right. It's still if that is the cause of neurons, that'll be a part
We
of
can call it
neurology.
quantum neurology, for
Right. So
example.
the question
It's
here
not
is that
classical
none of that
neurology.
matters. So what we're saying here is that the neurologists are the ones who determine what the best theory is. No one else cares. The quantum biologist, you don't even get an opinion until you can determine that it has some effect in neurology. You get no say. So if you want to say there's a best theory,
Yeah,
you got to convince the neurologist. No one else gets an opinion.
yeah, more or less. But I can send you the paper. This is a paper that
I've
looked
read it.
into
I've
all
looked
these
at the
quantum
Orgeois
consciousness
theory.
theories.
I think they're all ridiculous. Just God of the gaps. So making a comparison between an amoeba that you don't understand and claiming that because you don't understand it is therefore fundamentally random and there's some analogous fundamental randomness to an amoeba and to quantum particles is ridiculous. It makes no sense. It's just a classical anthropocentrism of consciousness. It's far more reasonable to include the amoeba is determined by some physical thing in the amoeba we can't measure yet. Saying that it's fundamental, there's fundamental randomness in the amoeba, just like there's fundamental randomness in quantumness, does not make sense because we don't know enough about biology to make that even a remotely reasonable conclusion yet.
Yeah, and that is where the similarities to the quantum world start, because in the quantum world you have the same problem, which is why still some, or not some, many scientists think, maybe quantum physics is really deterministic after all.
Well, no, quantum physics, we have
But
significantly more information about the randomness features. We don't have anywhere near enough about the amoeba to come to the same conclusions.
yes and no, because in the end, um, we've studied biological organisms into much detail, and we have not found exactly an explanation for some things. And so now we need to hypothesize why this would
No.
lie. And this is one hypothesis. And basically, this is always what you do. If you have two similar effects, you look at can they be the same
Well,
effect?
there's nothing similar about those. So again, the only analogy, like biology is the most complex field in all of science. Biology and neurology are the two most complex
Yes,
fields. Physics is not even close to as complex, not even
yes.
remotely as close. So we know a lot about physics. We know a lot about quantum information compared to biology. Biology is significantly more complicated. So saying that, well, we've tested all of this stuff in biology, therefore we can conclude the amoeba is purely random. It's like taking a glass of, like taking this cup and then dipping it into the ocean and say, ah, there's no whales in this cup, therefore there must be no whales in the ocean. Like, it makes no sense to make that broad of a generalization off something we know so little about. So to say that there's some analogy between, we haven't found the determining factor in amoeba, even though we know less than 1/10 of 1% about anything about the biological structure of an amoeba, makes
Yeah,
no
but
sense.
why is it, I mean, why is the hypothesis absurd? I mean,
But
you see random behavior.
oh yeah, so
Why shouldn't it be similar in effect?
because it's not random, it's just we can't understand it. So if the
I mean,
Romans 2,000 years ago,
it's clearly random. The question is a determinism underlying the randomness.
that's so if we were a Romans 2,000 years ago and we looked up at lightning, lightning looks random because we don't understand it. Could we conclude 2,000 years ago, would it be reasonable to say that lightning is consciousness?
Um, no, but
How is that
that's
different?
not that's yeah, because basically we know that there is a process going on that we don't that we try to explain in the quantum effects, and we see similar effects that might have the same explanation. So this is, I mean, for a lightning that pops out somewhere, in the end, it's also down to quantum effects. But the lightning is passive; it does not. Basically, the difficult question is here: what is agency? Why are
Well,
things? What is the difference
no,
between
no, no.
alive and
We don't,
dead
I don't
things?
want
Is
to
the
talk about
question, right?
agency yet because we're just looking at the quantum particle. So let's assume we know quantum physics and we know that quantum randomness is a thing, and assume we are living 2,000 years ago with knowledge about lightning. So we have no knowledge of lightning. We just see, oh, look, there's a random event in the sky that we can't predict. We could say, oh, those look really similar. There's a random thing in quantumness we can't predict. There's a random
Yes.
a random result in electricity or lightning that we can't predict. Based on your reasoning, we could come to the same conclusion and say, well, those are both the same thing. Lightning, the quantum randomness is caused by lightning because they're both random.
Or lightning is caused by the quantum
No,
randomness, which then would be close to the truth.
no, no. So,
And
so
this is what I'm trying to
I'm
say.
saying lightning.
We have found only randomness. We have found only once in physics, in quantum. Everything is deterministic, but somehow quantum
No,
physics
we
told
found
us no,
randomness
there's
in
things that
every
are
single
random.
place we couldn't explain something. It looks random. Every single time we can't explain something and it's random. So
Yeah, but the only thing where we are relatively certain that it's really random is quantum physics.
right, and we are equally as not certain
Yeah.
about the amoeba as we are not certain about every other thing we don't know, because the amount we know about the amoeba is equivalent to the amount people knew about lightning 2,000 years ago. So it's equally as unreasonable to conclude the amoeba is truly random and is
Yeah,
therefore
but
analogous
if you
to.
have this true randomness, as long as you accept that quantum is true randomness, you have two paths to come to allow for free will. I mean, it's not saying it's proven, but to allow for free will. One is quantum randomness is directly involved in consciousness, which would directly give you free will if it's really random, or if Archer is true. And the second part is what I tried to argue in the beginning, because it's
Remember, that's a false dichotomy. I said that before. So we
because you can go into,
false dichotomy. So remember, we
no,
both agree the randomness is there. The randomness could be caused
yeah,
by consciousness or it could be caused by a non-conscious something. And there's infinitely many non-conscious somethings it could be caused by. It could be internal to the proton or the atom and it could be non-conscious. It could be external
yeah,
like a field and could be non-conscious. There's lots of different alternatives that could cause the randomness. The question is
yeah, but
why did you conclude it was conscious? And the reason you gave was because it's analogous to an amoeba.
if
We don't know anything
yeah,
about amoebas. That's like making the analogous to lightning argument. If we don't understand lightning, we don't have any idea what causes it. We just think lightning is some fundamental force in the universe or whatever, and we could conclude that it's random. The lightning is random, just like the quantum particle is random. Therefore, they must be made of the same thing because they're
yeah,
both
but
random.
this is what we also agreed on, that we have lots of evidence that suggests that quantum effects are involved in biological decision making, which is why this hypothesis of Ochoa was what I was trying going back to this. If this is true, if quantum randomness is directly involved in consciousness, then we can have free will is the one. The other is, even if it's not, as long as there's quantum randomness that is truly random, and our brain looks at this randomness and makes decision based on this randomness with a goal, then there's also a possibility for a degree of free will. Not saying that we necessarily have this free will, but right now just trying to explain to you how we could have free will based on quantum randomness. There's two paths to that.
No, so that's the part where I'm trying to get to here. So if we grant quantum, we both grant quantum randomness is real. The question is what is it? Is it made of consciousness or is it made of non-conscious something?
Yeah.
Both can explain all of the data. We have no reason to believe amoebas are conscious at all. None whatsoever. So we see this feature of quantum randomness in particles, and we see this feature of quantum randomness that can affect the neurons in amoeba. And we see this feature of quantum randomness that can affect the protons in rocks. So the problem here is that when you make a leap from how is this evidence that it has anything to do with consciousness? That's the problem we're trying to bridge here. Saying that there's a thing in an amoeba that happens that can't be measured has nothing to do with consciousness. That can be easily explained by my hypothesis that it's a non-conscious thing affecting the neurons in the amoeba, just like the same non-conscious thing can affect the protons in the rock. So what about that gives you evidence for consciousness?
Yeah, there's lots of evidence for this. I wanted to get a bit back from the theory because I just wanted to. The reason I didn't bring it up in the first place is because it's not proven. And to me, I've looked into the evidence that is there, but this is just, it takes a long time. All these experiments that Stuart Hameroff does with bringing you into basically giving you anesthetics and bringing you back, and all this evidence suggests that maybe this microtubule theory might be right. But just leaving aside this theory, because you're not, if this theory is wrong or right, if this was true, then we would have free will. This is what I'm trying to coax out. Or if we would still say we don't have free will if this was true.
Well, I still don't.
And also saying that there's another way we could have free will that's not to do with this theory at all, what I tried to explain in the beginning.
Well, I still don't
Just,
understand what you would mean by free will in that context. So saying that
so if Ocho was true, if quantum particles really make a proto-conscious decisions, or the simplest form of consciousness, just deciding left or right, if it's really up to the particle to decide, not guided by any external influence, would you call that a free will decision by the particle?
no, I'd still say that isn't a coherent definition of free will. So I'd still say you're just, the question
So,
is,
but I think right now you're just defining free will in a way that it's just never possible.
well, that's what I'm asking you, is how you define free will. Because if free will is defined as our consciousness' ability to affect our decisions in some way, like my literal thoughts can cause my actions, that seems to be impossible. Now, it can, obviously, the things that cause my actions, my thoughts are caused by prior things which are not my thoughts. Now, my thoughts in the present can change the way my brain structure will be in the future, but the thoughts in the present were caused by other things that were not my thoughts.
Yeah, but can you change your thoughts?
My thoughts can change based off of my prior neural structure that weren't my thoughts.
Yeah, but that is exactly what I said with the second livid experiment with basically the interrupt. That basically your thoughts are going on, there's potential building up in your brain, and you consciously register something and say, "Oh no, I abort."
Which is
And this is
neurological structure in the brain. Phineas Gage had that part of his brain damaged, so that's why. But I just don't understand what you mean by free will here. So,
yeah, but I think you're trying to just see free will as either magical, unconnected to biology, or completely impossible. But what I'm trying to get to is how would you find out if something has free will inside
well, you need a
biology or
definition
physics?
first. You need to define what free will
Yeah,
is first. So
I gave you my definition. My definition is basically trying to explain it simple. If the U is a black box, you don't know what that U is, but you know that U is. And if the variables going into that U and what that U, so basically you have variables going into what U is, which is what you're saying, your thoughts, your underlying brain chemistry. and you have some stuff going out. What you do then, what you think, how you change the thought, what you do then based on what's going in. The question is, of free will to me is what's inside you, inside that box, whatever it is that constitutes you. Do the variables going in completely determine what's going out? And does what's going on in you actually change the variables that will go in the future? So basically, this is the feedback loop concept, that basically what you are, what constitutes you, changes the course of the universe. That basically what's going in on variables alone does not determine what you do, especially in the long run, because you feedback what you as you're thinking about it then feeds back into what is you. You change what you are yourself.
Okay, so
And
like
that
if you
basically
imagine a
that just requires determinism. That happens in computers, and the more complex
right, I understand what you're
AI
saying, but I
gets,
don't
the
understand how
more
it's free will.
closer it gets to what I would call free will.
I
There's
understand.
degrees of free will. There's like you're 99% free and
I
you're
understand.
0
I
point
understand what you're
something
saying, but I don't
free.
understand how any of that is free will. So imagine there's a timeline, like before I'm born, I have no consciousness, and we have quantum fluctuations and determined physical forces, and those things combine to produce my consciousness, and I have my first thought. And so my first thought is 100% determined by none of my thoughts. So there were no thoughts, then there was a thought. And now, once I've had this thought, which was 100% determined by those other things, which were not me, it seems like I had no free will at that point, right? Did I have free will at the
Yeah,
point of my first thought?
this is this is something that Sam Harris makes, which says this misunderstanding of the concept. For one,
I don't understand the
um,
concept at all. So it's not. I'm not trying to.
basically, if you say your thoughts are basically your thoughts arise from the subconscious, and then you consciously play around with these thoughts. So yeah, the thoughts popping in is determined by completely by the variables going in. But what you do with this thought then, for all we know, is not determined by anything outside your brain.
It's not what I'm asking. So I'm asking like before I was born. So I wasn't born. I had no free will, right?
Yes.
You would agree there's no free will before you're
Yeah,
born.
you were not there, so
Okay. So now I'm born. I have my first thought. Do I have free will?
yes, because you can then alter the thought. You can play with the thought, like
Well, no,
with
no, no, no.
the elephant you said.
This is on a timeline. Like t
A thought
equals
is not free will to me. Free will is what comes out in the end after you've done with your thinking and start having actions.
right. So what I'm saying here is that I want to go through a series of steps and see at what point do I gain free will. So the first step is I'm not born, so I don't have free will yet. Okay, I'm born. I have my first thought as a baby.
Yeah.
Um, and at this point, I'm guessing I still don't have free will because you define free will as the ability to.
No, I think I just answered right. So basically, you have your first thought, and the question that I would say if you have free will is, after this thought, you will do something, blink, burp, or whatever. And the question is when this first thought arises by anything outside of what is you, is it determined what you do after thought to 100% certainty? So basically, if you wind the universe back and run this first thought over and over again, will you always do the same thing or not? And then if you not always do the same thing, is it determined by something inside what constitutes you or by something outside what constitutes you?
Okay, so I have the first thought. Now, if we rolled the clock back and I have the thought again, and there is a uranium 238 molecule in my brain, and it causes me to react differently to the thought, is that free will?
It could be considered free will if it goes on for a long enough time, but
What do you
this
mean?
is the weakest form of free will. This is
What
what
do
I
you
say. This is
mean goes on for
the
long enough
weakest
time?
form of freedom. Basically, if it's just a random event that causes you to make different thoughts, but it's just inside your brain, not outside, this would be a very, very weak form of free will. But a more complex option of free will would be basically if how can you interact with this thought basically? Is what you do with the thoughts conscious determined, or all just predictable in the beginning? So basically, what happens in your brain? How does your brain make a decision? Is this deterministic or purely deterministic or not? And if it's purely deterministic, then I would say it's you only have this very, very limited, very, very weak free will, like you said, with quantum decay in your brain influencing what you do, which would still make you an independent actor. That's different than the rock, because the rock then does nothing based on this quantum change, but you actually change your behavior and can influence that behavior when you learn, okay, I randomly, because something happened to me, did A and not B that I would usually have done. You can then learn to do A more often because it was actually beneficial.
Let
So
me ask.
that
Let
is the
me.
weakest form. That is the deterministic form of free will. That it's not really free, but it's still, for me, I consider it a certain degree of freedom, which is what I would grant any complex AI.
Okay, let me ask you a different way. Is my first thought a result of my free will?
No,
Okay, why?
because the thought is composed by your subconsciousness and arises in your consciousness. And consciousness then only starts with the thought. Once the thought is conscious, then your conscious process starts. I mean, it's difficult. I consider subconscious also part of you and part of your free will. But if I'm going with you because you're so focused on the conscious decision. And then if you say it really needs to be a conscious decision that you consider it free will, then I would say no, that the thought is not connected to free will.
But by your definition, it seems like that would still be a result of your free will, because the amoeba you said has some level of free will. There's some base level of free will that would exist prior to any thought.
Yeah, I mean, under my definition of free will, I consider me the actor, that what is me, not just my consciousness. I consider my subconsciousness and my unconscious parts of my brain also part of what is me.
Okay, so your first thought is a result of your free will in your model.
Of the weakest form of it, yes.
Okay, I think that's a major problem. It's because when most people use the term free will, they're saying that my thoughts themselves are the originator of the decision. And if the thought is a result of something else, then that
Yeah,
wouldn't be what people normally think of as free will.
I know, but this is basically why I think this is a misunderstanding, because people think that the consciousness is just a self outside of the brain, but the consciousness is part of the brain. But so basically, what I wanted to say is that this arising thought in my model is part of the very, very weak free will that I explained with the basic simple feedback loop. I still think that the higher consciousness, that what you do with this thought then, is not explainable by a pure computational approach, and requires some other mechanism, be it quantum mechanics or something else, because it's just not just basically the behavior we see does not fit the explanation that it's just a purely computational thing. And the real freedom is basically what you do with the thought. Basically, like, you're told by a researcher to click a button, and the researcher says, okay, we do certain we show you sounds before you want to, at random intervals in time, and when you hear the sounds, you then please decide, proceed to click like you wanted to, or abort and not click. And basically, this is basically the thought I want to click arises from your subconsciousness. Is relatively weak free will. But then the abortion, basically, when you hear the sound consciously and you're okay, my consciousness now has these two things. I know I just wanted to click, but I heard the sound and I'm asked to now consider if I want to click or not. And you don't really go into a conscious deliberation if you click or not. And this is what I say where the stronger free will lies, and what is not fully understood yet how it works.
Okay, so I want to go back to the before I exist, I have no free will. My first thought is a result of my free will, which existed before any thought I had. So let's go to the amoeba. Amoebas have some level of free will in your argument. Um, at what point
Yeah, and
when
that they apparently decide to
right,
flee or
right.
to
So
freeze.
at what point starting rocks don't have free will, right?
No.
Okay, so at some point between a rock and an amoeba, they gain free will.
Yeah, this is essentially comes to what is the definition of life, right? What is the difference between a rock and a living thing? Is essentially the question here.
Sort of, yeah. So if you're saying
Yeah.
that rocks don't have free will, amoebas do have free will, what's the difference between them? Like, seems like quantum effects affect both of them. Why would you say one is conscious and one doesn't?
Yeah, what I say is basically just based on observation that there is a difference. The amoeba reacts unpredictably and reacts basically. It does things it obviously has goals, and the rock doesn't. So I think this ability to choose to run away or not, to make decisions, is what I call free will. And I would think even in non-conscious or pre-conscious things like the amoeba, this free will exists, and is, in my opinion, what determines what distinguishes life from non-life. That just non-life, just a quantum effect happens to them and they do nothing with them, or another external influence happens to them and they just don't react. But living beings react, and essentially react in ways that we cannot fully predict, and that unfortunately right now also we cannot explain.
Okay, so certain combinations of non-organic chemicals can seek out food. Like viruses can seek
Yeah.
out food. They're non-living, essentially.
No, this is highly disputed whether you call viruses living or not.
Right. So does a virus have free will?
So under my definition, a virus is right on the borderline. I would already call it alive, and I would say it has a very, very limited free will. But basically, the virus seems to be fundamental difference from the bacteria, which is why single cell organisms are considered alive and viruses are not. So the virus already has some agency and some goals that it wants to replicate, um, and then it can change its behavior to a certain degree. But there's a fundamental difference between the amoeba and the virus, and that the virus is almost entirely predictable, while the amoeba's behavior is not.
Okay, so how do you go from a rock to a virus and add free will?
I'm not sure if I understand
Because
the
you said
question.
viruses have some limited amount of free will. Rocks do not have a limited amount of free will. How do you get from a rock to a virus, from the
Do you mean
no amount to the little limited amount?
how do you get there, logically or biologically or physically, or what do you mean?
Yeah, any of those will work.
Yeah,
Like I don't, you don't need like a technical scientific definition. It's just
this
philosophical
is what I
possibility.
meant. The only convincing theory that I've heard is that of Penrose, how you get there. I mean, we know that this somehow happens, and I have not heard any convincing theory on how this happens besides that of Penrose.
How does his theory explain how viruses get free will?
Yeah, it explains basically that the once uh, a life form evolves to a part where it starts basically not just reacting to outer things, but actually to orchestrate quantum effects together, then it so basically it's he says consciousness is an emergent property. There's proto consciousness, which is basically the decision of a particle. That's what he calls it. And there, this proto consciousness, if more and more particles organize together to not have this binary decision in one particle, but actually organize the decisions together in a more complex decision, this is what gives rise to consciousness, this organization. The more complex the organization is, the higher levels of consciousness you have. I don't have any other explanation. This is a really complicated topic, but just what we know is that this difference is there, and we cannot explain it any better, in my opinion.
Well, so I'm trying to understand how it explains it at all. So obviously there's some kind of a choice of a, if you want to call it a choice, that the random event occurs, and depending on the physical structure inside of the virus, it will be affected by the random event. And you're just calling that free will.
So basically, as I said, if you have random events and give a classical computer the option to influence the probabilities of these events with goals, then there can be free will, in my opinion. This is the more complicated stuff. What is basically what is the difference? Not so really between a rock and an amoeba, but what is the difference between an amoeba and artificial intelligence?
You're asking me, like in my model?
No, that's basically the question is underlying the thinking of Penrose, and why before he postulated his theory, he wrote the book The Emperor's New Mind, where he actually looks at exactly this: what can computers do and what can't they do, and comes to the conclusion that basically, okay, even our most complex computers that are way more complex in their processing capabilities than any amoeba still cannot exhibit this unpredictable behavior that the amoeba can. And now with machine learning, we have recently given computers very complex, very human-like abilities, but there's still some abilities that somehow they lack. There's some chess moves that a computer just cannot come up no matter how you train him, and other examples on fundamental differences where simple biological beings can exhibit behaviors that we just cannot get a computer to exhibit.
Can't quantum computers make random decisions just fine?
Quantum computers, yes.
So computers can do it. It's fine.
Yeah, but only quantum computers, which is why basically then scientists said, like Penrose and others, that okay, there must be some part of the brain that works similar to a quantum computer, maybe not exactly like the quantum computers we have in the lab, but this might be the thing. And a quantum computer, in my opinion, no matter if OR is true or not, a quantum computer, if it has sufficiently many qubits, will at some point be indistinguishable from a human.
That's a good testable
With
prediction.
very,
That I like. So that we can say that if we can build a computer with sufficiently high numbers of entangled qubits that is not conscious, would that falsify your theory? So like if we could build two different quantum computers with sufficiently complicated qubit systems, one is conscious and one is not, would that falsify your theory?
I mean, it depends if I mean, Penrose's approach to falsifying it and Hameroff's is better because they actually probe the brain to see if they can find traces of this quantum effects ongoing and orchestrating in the microtubules,
Well,
which would
that's
directly
begging
falsify
the
it.
question.
They are really trying to falsify it. A quantum computer, so basically, a quantum computer getting conscious or being indistinguishable from a conscious being to us would probably prove it. But if it falsifies it, we wouldn't. If it doesn't become consciousness, we would not know if we just did the coding wrong. But my opinion is that
But why would
from
the
what I've
coding make a
seen
difference?
what I've already seen in AI and robotics is that I'm pretty sure that within 10 or 20 years, even classical computers will be very similar. Though I think, based on what Penrose wrote in Emperor's New Mind, and based on my own observations, that there's still a fundamental difference. You can maybe emulate the human to 90%, but there's maybe 10% left that a classical computer cannot do, as it seems today. But I think a quantum computer, if programmed right and with enough qubits, might be able to really mimic a human that we cannot distinguish it anymore.
Right. So what you're saying is that if the quantum randomness itself is the proto-consciousness, and any sufficiently complicated combination of the proto-consciousness will end up with a consciousness like ours. To falsify that, you would need to build several sufficiently complicated combinations of these quantum entangled particle
No,
systems.
that's a different question, because a quantum computer definitely does not, for all we know right now, does not use that mechanism. It does not orchestrate the qubits together. So this is why they test it by basically using anesthetics on
Right, no,
microtubules and measuring the frequencies.
wait. So I'm granting that. I'm granting that. What I'm
directly.
saying is that if your theory is right, we can take a quantum computer and orchestrate the qubits together. And if we do that with a sufficient amount, it will always produce a consciousness. Because that's what consciousness is.
Yeah.
So in order to falsify your theory, we just have to do that for two different systems. One has to be conscious and one does not conscious. And that would falsify the system, because if your theory is true, then any sufficiently complicated orchestrated system of qubits would produce consciousness by definition, because that's what consciousness is. So if we can do that and not produce a consciousness, and it's just a single, essentially no different than a regular computer, that would falsify your theory.
Yeah, as it's not the best way to falsify. There's better ways, and I would say it otherwise. What would falsify the theory is if in 10 years we have an AI that uses a not non-quantum computer, and if that AI at some point becomes really indistinguishable from humans and overcomes all the obstacles that computer scientists have laid out to distinguish computers from human minds, if we can overcome all this and cannot find one anymore, it will also be falsified probably because
Yeah, that's a great example
uh,
too.
this would basically show that it's possible without it.
Cool. Yeah, I
I mean,
think that's a great way to think about the theory. So yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense in the way that you proposed it. If we can think about it in the terms of those two methods as being a way to falsify it, I can understand better what your theory is saying, and that makes more sense to me. So that's very helpful.
yeah, and this is what I was referring to basically. I say the strong free will that would come from Orchard and the weak free will that I explained, but um, as I say, a sufficiently complex AI to me can really exhibit what I would call free will, uh, in the sense that it learns and that you at some point cannot tell from outside influence anymore what it's going to do. But the question is, can it really become conscious, and can it do everything that we can do? Especially, can it do can a computer do this that you say consciously deliberate on aborting or not aborting a decision that you previously made in a way
Thought you were going to say a
that
baby.
is not,
Aborting a
yeah,
baby.
in a way that is just not basically with a computer. Usually what they do is we know that they loop through these thought processes, and if you interrupt it, it goes out and starts a new thought process. But what we actually can do as humans is really on the fly, that the potential is still there, and within microseconds interrupt a decision that we're trying to make, which is what Libet showed. And this is something, this more advanced Libet experiment that I described, is something that right now AI cannot do, for example.
Yeah, so I would say that in my hypothesis, normal computers are going to be able to surpass humans in every way without any need for quantum at all. And I think that's going to become apparent in the next 20 to 50 years. So I think it's going to be falsified fairly quickly in just basic computer science. That would be my position. But yeah, those last points made your theory a lot clearer for me, and that definitely helped. So thank you for that. There was a
I
question
mean, I
from.
would be sad if it was just that weak free will, but I would still call it a limited free will. And maybe I should explain why I think this is so important to me. Is because basically I think the justice system we have right now is crap, and we need to overthink it. Like the Netherlands, they already have a 5-tiered system where it's not like you're responsible or completely mentally ill and not responsible, but they have like 5 steps in between. And if we have no free will if we have really no free will, then we would need a completely different justice system that's just focused on, okay, how can we prevent this person from in the future doing bad stuff again, and not focusing on punishing them at all. But if really there's a degree of freedom, we then need to look on, okay, how free was a person? Like for me, a banker who steals money in a cold rational decision, and he does not need the money, is much worse than a poor person who's starving, who steals money or food, even though our justice system usually treats it just the other way around. And this is why I want to really understand, like, how free are we in the decision? Is there a strong free will? Is there just a weak free will? And if we have the weak free will, how strong is it really in our brains? How much influence do we really have with our conscious deliberation, however it works, to change what we think and how we'll act in the future?
Yeah, I would say that looking at it from the perspective of the justice system, the first system you described of one that we try to make sure that people won't harm people in the future is a far better system regardless of whether or not there's free will. So we should just assume no one has free will because it shouldn't make a difference if they do or not. It should always be about prevention of future things. And I think that even if we grant your kind of free will, that there's some kind of quantum randomness free will kind of a thing, it seems likely that all decisions that humans make are sufficiently determined by neurological structure that every single such criminal action will have a sufficient deterrent to prevent it in the future. So we wouldn't need to consider free will even if we had it in the context of the
Yeah, I
justice
think
system.
you need a different deterrence based on whether you have free will or not. Because basically, if um, if basically if you're not free to choose, you need a deterrence that is really strong enough that you don't do it again. Maybe we really need to kill people again if they commit. If there's basically this is if there's no free will, maybe sociopath. We should think about if we have to euthanize sociopath if there's really no free will,
Well,
because
I don't
sociopaths are
think.
very likely to commit a crime again
Well, no, I don't think you'd
under
have to do
this
that at
model.
all. So I
But if the
think.
sociopath actually has, based on his inside deliberation, an influence on his decision, then we can. There's a different, completely different strategy on how to influence a person if there is free will or if there's non-free will, and depending on how much free will you have.
Well, I'd say that sociopathy is specifically just neurological. We can just shift the neurological structure in the brain and solve sociopathy without any reference to free will or any kind of quantum interactions in the brain. I don't think we would need to consider that.
Yeah, but right now we cannot patch that with a chip, right?
Right, but I think we're going to be able to do that far before we can
Yeah,
do anything with the quantum randomness stuff.
but right now it's the same with pedophilia, basically. Um,
Paleo what?
pedophilia.
Oh, gotcha.
The question is, can basically just based on the punishment, based on how we educate them, can they change their behavior? Or do we need to physically rewire something in their brain from the outside to make them change their behavior? That's essentially the underlying question. Can they just sit there, deliberate, okay, how can I keep myself from doing that again? How can I become a better person? How can I not commit crimes anymore or not at all? Does my deliberating about this stuff actually change something? Or does somebody else outside need to do something for me to change my behavior?
Yeah, I'd say that's purely a neurological question. Like their ability to make decisions or have impulse control is completely determined by a very specific part of the brain. That was the part Phineas Gage had blasted out of his brain. So I'd say that that is purely just determined by neurological structure. And if you have the correct neurological structure, you can. And if you don't, then you can't.
Yeah, but this is what I say. The evidence does not really suggest, both the various versions of the Libet experiments, if you look at them, don't really suggest that. And basically, there's people that lose almost all the cortex, basically all the thing where we thought the consciousness was, and just mostly have the brain stem. And we found out that these people are actually still conscious sometimes. So um, basically, the model that we had with just neuronal classical computing for consciousness, it seems just not to work. And this is why I'm so interested in this. For one, because I when I was at university, I was in the robotics lab, and I started to get this interest, and I found out, okay, like here are these differences, and I also read Penrose's book, and so yeah, really there's fundamental differences that I can point out. What we cannot do with the AI, even though it has enough processing power, that should be able to do it, and that simple organisms can do. And all these experiments that, like the abortion limit, or there's even some liver experiments that show effects that seem to suggest that some of the salts that we act on some of the salts before the salt even appears, um, which are really basically there's one experiment where they cut open the brain and they stimulate your finger and they stimulate the brain directly. And for some reason, it takes much longer for the direct stimulus to register consciously with you than if the finger is stimulated. And there's lots of these experiments that all suggest that somehow there's more to it than just basically a computer. And or at least that even if it's a computer, it's a very sophisticated computer that really can feedback and train itself to do things that we would not expect it to do, that we can't get a program computer to do yet.
Yeah,
So
I think
this is exactly the core of the question. Is it?
yeah, for sure, it's definitely the core of the question, but I think it's just a magnitude question. If there's a sufficient amount of neuroplasticity guided in one direction in the brain, it's going to cause you to do something, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. That would be my interpretation. So I think that
Yeah, that's again the question of what is the you. I mean, if it's in the brain, I would say it's probably already you. if it's a brain process. But even if you say limit the you to just the conscious you, um, it seems from the evidence that this actually changes something. And this is exactly what the experiments are trying to test. Basically, one, for me, the most important question on free will is basically is only external influences coming into your brain determine your behavior, or is internal process of your brain of what is you involved in determining it? And then the second question is, if whatever is your consciousness, does this consciousness actually have a top-down ability to alter your thoughts and behaviors? And for me, from what I've seen in the experiments, it looks like we have that.
Right. I think that's not correct. I think that if someone puts an electrode in your brain, the electrode wins and you lose. You have no control over it. Whatever is going on in your brain is going to determine your thoughts, not the other way around. We got a super chat from Show Vertica. He's asked, can you define choice? Because choice is a conceptual explanation of potentials. It's not a reality. Nobody chooses because of the inability to do otherwise.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm trying to explain. Is choice. I mean, the debate is with free will is either you have 100% choice or no 0% choice. Basically, um, it's a correlation question. How much is what's going on in your brain, in your subconsciousness, and outside influences correlated with what goes in your consciousness and what your consciousness does? And if that correlation is 100%, you have no free will. If it's 0%, you would have libertarian free will. And obviously, we don't know it's not 0%, but I would argue that from the data, it suggested that we're somehow somewhere between 0 and 100 and not at 100. That's exactly the question.
Okay. She had a follow-up question. One example of choice. Dot dot dot. Let him finish that. Yeah, Charles and Solo says free will is impossible logically. I agree. That's my position. It seems like you're arguing for a position of compatibilism. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm saying is that basically, now compatibilism would be, do you have free will even if though the universe is deterministic? That's not what I'm saying. Um, the thing is basically, as I said, I gave you my definition before. A definition that is impossible, that by definition is not a good definition. So what I'm asking is, if the universe has quantum randomness and is otherwise determined by the laws of physics, there's no God, nothing beyond it, what would free will look like then, and do we have it? And this is why I came up with this. Basically, is what our consciousness does completely determined by external factors, or has it also internal capabilities to change the outcome? And that's essentially
Maverick asks, TJump, what are your thoughts on the orc ore, and do you find the experiments on tadpoles, etc., telling the single-celled organisms have rudimentary form of consciousness? I'd say that no. I think it's all just determined by underlying biological features that have nothing to do with consciousness, and we're going to probably discover those pretty soon, or once we get a basic AI configured with a regular computer, not a quantum computer, it'll be able to tell us a lot more about the biological questions, and I don't think it'll have anything to do with consciousness. Joe Mana, what type of free will can exist? I guess.
I mean, I think that's a question for you because I think I explained mine and you said none, right?
Yeah, I don't think there can be a type of. I don't think the word free could be defined as anything other than just determined or random, and I don't think any combination of determined and random can be.
Yeah, I mean, this. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you,
Oh,
but
it's
this
fine.
goes back to the question that I think you never answered. Whether to ask you if the particle goes to the left and right slit, and it's really determined by the particle and not by something outside. If that would be free will or not, I'm
Well,
not sure if you answered that.
no, I'd say that even if it's determined just by the particle, could be determined by some non-conscious thing in the particle. It doesn't need to be consciousness. So it's.
Yeah, but if it wasn't, so basically, if all the variables are internal, even if they are random, but if it's just inside the particle, would it be the particle's decision or not?
I'd say it could be consciousness or it could be not consciousness. So either one is possible. And I'd say it would be incoherent to say that just because it was internal to the particle that it was then necessarily consciousness.
Yeah, but what I wanted to find out is basically if really the particle, say, call it consciousness, call it whatever, in the particle, let's call it consciousness just to not make the answer complete. If the particle really did a conscious decision that's just inside the particle, would you call that free will or not?
Well, that's kind of the question. If consciousness can have some kind of a causal interaction, could that be free will? Maybe, but I don't think it can. So that's the part that I'm doubting. I'm doubting that anything that could be within a proton that could cause some kind of a causal result of randomness could ever be referred to as consciousness. I don't think that would apply. So I don't think, because whatever is causing that, I don't think would count as conscious. I don't think it would be fair to call it free will either.
So it's inherently the nature of randomness that we disagree upon. You say that randomness somehow must have some underlying causal structure. I say now.
Well, no, you would agree with that. So you're just saying that the cause of the randomness is consciousness, and I'm saying the cause of the randomness is a non-consciousness. So we're both agreeing that consciousness has some underlying nature to it. We just disagree about what that nature is likely going to be.
Yeah, but basically, even if it was non-conscious or proto-conscious or whatever you want to call it, for me, this would still be a decision by the particle, unless there is really an outside field that tells the particle what to do. If
well, I mean,
the particle does it,
and it depends what you mean by choice and decision. Like, it could just be a property in the particle that has nothing to do with a choice or a decision. It's just like spin or charm or some just property in the particle. It has like a randomness property or something that has. Why would you conclude or label that with consciousness?
Yeah, but essentially, this randomness property to me would still constitute a free will, because basically you have either
even if it wasn't conscious,
like either the decision was made by something in the particle that was not determined by external influences, or it was determined by external influences, and that's exactly the question. If it was not determined externally, then it, to me, it is the choice of the particle. So the question is, what a photon today does when you shoot it at a double slit, was that determined at the Big Bang by a causal structure that somehow controls the underlying randomness and made this particle do it? Or is it really the particle as an entity that does the decision?
Well, I mean, I could grant it's the particle or some property in the particle that wasn't determined at the Big Bang, and there's some randomness property in every particle, but I still, for it to count as consciousness or to count as free will, I would require that it has some kind of thought of a pink elephant kind of a thing. And if it doesn't have that, I'd say that the word consciousness and the word free will would not apply. I'd say it's no different than charm or spin or any other mass or any other actual non-conscious property that exists in the electron. So I'd say it's more likely that the randomness decision was more or less like the charm decision. It wasn't a decision at all. It was just a feature in the electron, but it's a non-determined feature rather than a determined feature.
Yeah, and this is probably where we disagree. I mean, I agree that it's not consciousness, and also Penrose calls it proto-consciousness to make the link, but it's not the same thing. But
well, that's
to
I
me,
don't think
that's
there's
essentially that would be what I consider freedom or free will, if the particle actually has this ability to make a choice that is not predetermined by anything outside it. I mean, maybe then just particles have this free will, and we're just trying to live with this free will of the particles. But I think from all we know that at least the particle has free will.
Yeah, my objection is
in a simple proto form of free will, not.
My objection is calling it proto-consciousness would be not correct, because there's no connection to consciousness there. That would be the part I'm objecting to. So I would say that it's something. There's something causing the randomness. It is a thing, but I don't think it's right to call it proto-consciousness any more than it's right to call it a proto-potato or a proto-pineapple.
Yeah. I think calling it proto-free will at least would probably make sense, in my opinion, if it's really internal to the particle, or at least to call it freedom of the particle.
That might make more sense. So like if you said freedom was the ability for some internal feature within the object itself to make an action, or to make an action of some kind which is not in any way determined by external forces. Like, yeah, I could grant that as some kind of proto-free will for sure. I just the proto-freedom, maybe proto-freedom of some kind, that could work. I would be happy with that. Oh yeah, Stephen Hoyt asks, why does free will require consciousness? Like, yeah, I mean, the will part seems to imply consciousness to me. So, but I can understand what Michael's saying, that yeah, there could be some kind of proto-freedom without consciousness. I can definitely grant that as a possibility. That makes sense. Nathan Sanders, do you think free will should be taught in schools? Trying to convince adults is nigh impossible a lot of the time. No, I don't think anything should be taught in schools that isn't empirically demonstrated, pretty much. Joe,
Agreed. Yeah.
if I eat a sandwich,
Unfortunately, they don't.
yeah, that's true. Schools teach a lot of very stupid things. Like, I went to a Catholic school, so they taught religion in my school. Like, wow. If I eat a sandwich, did I have the choice not to? Can we prove this empirically somehow? I think that's a question for you. Like, would it be possible to go back in time and have a sufficiently complicated quantum system
Yeah,
that could make him not eat a sandwich?
basically, if we find a way to rewind the universe, that would be the proof. It's just really difficult. I mean, the way to approximate is that you redo decisions that are very similar under very similar conditions. Basically, example of sometimes uses if you if you always on May 1st at 20 degrees go to your ice cream parlor and choose different flavors for no apparent reason, that might be free will. It's just the problem is that you always have so many variables going in that unless you rewind the universe, you might always be able to point to something and say, ah, maybe that was what determined it. But um, in the end, why I say that we probably have free will is because I think the data suggests it. I just don't have the ability to rewind the universe and do the actual experiment.
The Maverick asks, how do you account for anesthesia switching off awareness but retaining control over bodily function and a direct correlation to vibrations of microtubules?
Is that for me?
I think so.
Because that is basically part of what they do in the testing, and to my knowledge, it's completely that what they predicted, and which is why this over the past few years where we have actually developed. So basically, the history of OCHR is it was proposed in the early 90s, I think, and didn't really catch on. But then we had some findings in quantum biology, like that photosynthesis actually involves quantum entanglement or quantum tunneling. But basically, the advancement of the field of quantum biology then made physicists finally consider OCR and give Hammer the funding to do tests. And the first tests showed exactly what he predicted, and I don't see where the contradiction here was with the theory and what was said.
Yeah, I didn't understand his question very much, so I hope that answered it. I don't know if it was not. I think that's it for the question. So yeah, it was fun talking with you. I appreciate the time and the conversation. So and definitely that at the end there, the falsification method has helped a lot in explaining your position. So thanks again for coming on. Really appreciate it. It was a fun conversation.
Yes, thanks a lot for having me.
Yeah, and if you wanted to promote your YouTube channel again, so people can find it.
Yeah, it's engineering philosophy. I have it in the description. I hope that's shown in the video feed.
Oh, you put it in the description somewhere, or
no? I put the name of my channel in my name that's showing up.
Oh,
I
should. It's done. I have the names cropped out, so I'll.
But I will probably comment on the stream and add my link there.
Yeah, do that, and I'll pin it to the top. So I showed the picture there so that people could see it. All right. Thanks again. And I'm gonna go get some food. So I'll talk to you later.
Yeah. Thanks.